Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101. Tim Stratton is our guest today. Dr. Tim Stratton, a fellow, uh, I guess a professor of, they call me a professor of theology, but
Yeah,
is that your official title as well?
I think so. I think we're in the same boat.
Okay, yeah, I figured you'd have some higher ranking titles like a professor of philosophy and theology and all things difficult to understand. Yeah,
Yeah,
that they don't have a title like that, I guess, do they?
yeah. We'll have to talk to Braxton and Pritchett
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. I give you a better title than just professor of theology because you talk
Yeah,
about so much more. Well, and I oftentimes do go to you and others like Eric Hernandez, Braxton, Jonathan, others to get some of the philosophical side of things because I know you guys, uh, you know, spend a lot more time in that field and have done a really good job at it, especially you. And I'm not just saying that to flatter my guest by any means. I've been very impressed with the work that you've done. Um, Very much enjoyed your book, Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. If those are looking for a primer on Molinism and understanding it, this is a good one to go to. And I highly recommend it. And I know you've got some other books that just have recently come out that have other contributors. Why don't you tell our audience about that
yeah.
too?
Well, that's right. You mentioned Eric Hernandez. So Eric and I had the opportunity to each contribute a chapter to this book called Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions. And these are essays in honor of Dr. Frank Turek, who you've had on the show before. And Frank, I don't know if there's anybody who's done a better job in the apologetics field of trying to equip so many others. He doesn't want to be the only guy doing apologetics, that's for sure. He wants to equip and train others to follow in his footsteps. And so many of us got together and made this book together, and Eric was one of those guys. So Eric does a great job
Yeah.
arguing for the soul. And in this book, I'm going to talk about, I talk about free will quite a bit in this chapter, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, I love working with you at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, and we've got a great team there. I really don't know how we can. I mean, the team is so great; it's diverse. We don't
Yeah.
always agree with each other. We love Chris Date, and he disagrees with us on quite a bit, but we have such a loving
Poor
and
guy.
respect.
I feel like we gang up on him sometimes though, because
Well,
there's so many of
we
us
do.
freewheelers on our side, but
Yeah, that guy, he's tough. He can take it, and
no,
he
he
pushes
can.
back.
Yeah,
But what I love about Chris is we do that with love and respect, and that's something that's often missing in these dialogues today. So.
absolutely. And you also have a debate that's coming out today, if I'm not mistaken, on the Unbelievable broadcast. And I am really looking forward to it. In fact, you just sent me the link, and I added it in the show notes here on YouTube. Tell us about that debate, and have you seen it yet? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I haven't seen it yet. I think it's being released tonight. I think at 5 o'clock p.m. Central Time on the Premier Unbelievable YouTube channel. So yeah, keep
But
your
if you
eyes.
subscribe, like I have to Unbelievable, you can watch it now even, and that's
I
why I think
think that's
Tim is.
yeah.
I think Tim is chomping at the bit to go watch this because he hadn't got to see it for himself yet. Because I know if I've done a debate and it's just now being released, I would want to go watch it. So he'll have to wait and watch it with the rest of us. He'll even though you participated in it, and I texted Tim after it was over and I said, how'd you think it go? How did it go? And he said, I think it went about as well as I could expect it to. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to
Well,
be a good one. I'm sure you represented yourself very well. And
well, I
uh,
had a debate with Alex Malpass. He's a well-known and respected atheist philosopher, and he's written some pushback against the free thinking argument. Back when the argument was in its really early stages, and I thanked Dr. Malpass because it was some of his critiques that showed me that I needed to tighten some things up. And I would say both Dr. Alex Malpass and Dr. Guillaume Bignon, both excellent PhD philosophers, both push back hard against my argument. And I think, this is what iron sharpening iron does. I think ultimately it's made this free thinking argument stronger, and it's evolved quite a bit over the last couple of years because of the critiques of these excellent philosophers. And so I love getting pushback, and it's even better when people can do it respectfully and with love. And really, I told Alex Malpass, I said, he's an atheist, and I said, I feel like you've respected me even in the midst of disagreement better than many Christians do. So I said, thank you for offering a Christ-like example, even for Christ followers. So we need to. Yeah,
I mean, it truly. I was just going to say, it truly is the example of the iron sharpening iron kind of concept of allowing pushback, and you're one of the best at that, in my opinion, of allowing for people in your field to push back and do so with grace. You every time I've seen you respond to your critics, at least that are being somewhat responsible in their replies to you, and somewhat cordial in their replies to you. You always respond in kind. I had the opportunity to witness you and Dr. Ben Yong in the hallway of the EPS ETS meeting a couple of years ago, and I knew of your history, back and forth with your philosophical sparrings with each other, and I was just really impressed. And I've said this on the broadcast in your absence as well as in your presence, but I was just really impressed, Tim, with how humble you were in talking to Dr. Ben Yong, and really you were. It felt like to me you were genuinely asking for his feedback and his pushback, and taking almost a deferential role of humility with him, and saying, help me understand this. What do you mean by this? And I just really, really respected that, because so oftentimes you see in those kinds of hallways the kind of the attitude of superiority of, here, I'll show you what I think now, and people trying to talk over each other. And your humility really spoke to me. It's one of the reasons I've gotten to know you better, and I like you so much, is that conversation that I just happened to walk up on and just overhear. I don't even know you knew I was standing there, but you just really, you really just in humility just kind of asked questions, and you were listening, and you were following up with questions. And even though you have a very strong opinion and a very, robust defense for your position, when you're encountering somebody who disagrees with you, you do so with grace and humility, and I just really, really appreciate that about you. I can't thank you enough for that.
Well, thank you. I'll be the first one to say that I'm not perfect, and this is a tough business. You make a lot of enemies when you argue against, as you well know, you make enemies when you argue for and against different positions.
Just a few.
Yeah, just a few. And and sometimes it hurts. Sometimes the attacks hurt, especially when I don't mind my arguments being attacked. I expect it. I invite it. I want my arguments to be attacked. But when they start to make it personal, when they start to try to say, oh, this guy's a horrible scholar, or this guy has horrible character. I've had one person say, Tim Stratton is just like Ravi Zacharias. I'm like, what in the world? Where is this coming from? And when people are trying
maybe that could be considered a compliment if you cut out the secret part of his life.
It was meant. It was not meant as a compliment.
Oh my gosh.
And it's just, why can't we? And this is from Christians. And I just want to say, guys, attack my argument. Go after it. Try to destroy it, because if it's a bad argument, I want it to be exposed. But why do you have to go after my character? Why do you have to go after my scholarship? Why do you have to go after my intellect? When you start doing that, it kind of shows maybe the argument is stronger. Than you really think it is, because that's what. Go after me.
Yeah, if an opponent has a good argument, they'll make it. When they don't have a good argument, they'll use fallacies. And the ad hominem fallacy being the worst of them, when they attack the messenger versus the message, and that's unfortunate that does happen. But it shouldn't be characterized as the representation of all non-libertarian free will advocates, so to speak.
Yeah.
Whether they're Calvinist or not. Because when
Oh,
you're
yeah.
debating, you're not just debating Calvinists. Obviously, you're debating
Right.
naturalistic, determinist, and other groups. And so, anybody who doesn't affirm your particular worldview, um, not all of them act that way. And the
Yes.
fact that you've acknowledged that you've put out there those who do cordially push back, and you thank them for that, and then
Mm,
you make corrections, you
yeah.
update it, you make it better.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
what scholarships should be doing. That's what we should be doing
Right.
as scholars, is how do I tweak this? And I've done the same thing, even from pushback I've gotten from Chris Date and from others along the way. I'll phrase things differently.
Yeah.
For example, Date really came at me about using the word arbitrary, because the way it's connoted today is different than the way Edwards used it and the way Calvin used it. And even though I've defined arbitrary for what I mean by it, he just said still it has a real negative connotation in today's world. And
Mm,
so it doesn't always communicate what you want it to communicate. And so I've always tried to be careful and maybe use the word unilateral instead of
mm.
arbitrary. Or if I use the word arbitrary, I'll explain it a little bit more about what
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
those kinds of things, because it helps you to do better at critiquing your opponent when you listen to your opponents and
Yeah.
actually engage with their arguments. And so what I really want to do today, Tim, is to really help the audience to see and understand the free thinking argument first, because that's kind of what you're known for. Um,
Mm,
and I think what you've developed and you've grown, and it's also developed into some other spin-off arguments that I
yeah.
want you to introduce to the crowd, to the audience as well. And I've asked Tim to do both of these things, and he's graciously given us his time to do this today, and I really appreciate this. But I'm going to respond as a layman, because I am, when it comes to many of these arguments. And I want our audience, even if they have no philosophical degrees, if they've never really delved into these arguments and understanding, I really want them to walk away with what is meant by this argument, and why it's a logically sound argument, and therefore requires people like Dr. Binyang and others to publish works to oppose it. In other words,
Mhm.
I think they can recognize that there's some validity to arguments that are being proffered into the world of scholarship, and therefore the reason that they're writing against you is because they see that your argument is making headway. It has
Mhm.
some teeth to it, and so
Yeah.
they need to be willing to engage with it, and some of them are. And so I want our audience to understand it, because it goes very much in line with what we argue here with regard to our soteriological perspective of affirming man's responsibility. Yes, still affirming the sovereignty of a good and gracious God, but we understand these theological concepts may be different than our Calvinistic friends, and so we want to try to unpack that a little bit today and help people to understand it. So, would you walk us through the free thinking argument?
Yeah. So, C.S. Lewis, in his book Miracles, first published in 1947, I believe. Second edition was out in 1960. But he wrote something very profound. He said, reasoning doesn't happen to us, we do it. Every train of thought is accompanied by the I think. And so, I encourage people to dwell on that. What that two simple sentences are so powerful. Let me say it again. Reasoning doesn't happen to us. We do it. Right? Every train of thought is accompanied by the I think. All right. So this is the big idea behind the free thinking argument, and also what I've dubbed the deity of deception argument that I'll get to later. But it's the idea that humans are more than mere passive cogs whose mental activity is exhaustively determined by either mindless or deceptive antecedent conditions. That means prior conditions, things that were even around before you were even born, right? So none of this is under our control, but rather that humans are active, free thinkers who have the power, and I think it's a supernatural power, to do our due diligence, to be careful, and to even be more careful while thinking things through. And to ultimately, as scripture says, to take our thoughts captive, 2 Corinthians 10:5, before bad thinking takes us captive, that Paul
Mhm.
warns us of in Colossians 2:8. So now the free thinking argument has been offered in various forms over the past 12 years now. I first developed the first iteration of it when I was going to school at Biola University in Scott Smith's classroom. And I started advancing it back then, and it started getting some pushback. Even not too long after that is when Alex Malpass wrote 2 blog articles against it. But because of the pushback, it's evolved rather quickly, I'd say, even over the past 2 years, even since I published the Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism book. I think the argument in that book is pretty good, but it's grown a lot stronger even over the past 2 years. And multiple philosophers now, I'm actually editing a book with Tyson James, co-editing it. And it's a book that was started by J.P. Moreland. He's writing a chapter and the foreword to this book. And then 15 philosophers are all joining forces, talking about why arguments from reason, which would include the free thinking argument, but really why all arguments from reason that are, can really be traced back to C.S. Lewis and his impact, and really before him, but he's the guy that really made it front and center. Show why arguments from reason need libertarian freedom. So really excited about this. Currently working on this project right now with these awesome scholars. I'm just humbled and honored to be a part of that. I'm the only non-professional philosopher. Do I engage in philosophy? Yes, but everybody does. But am I a professional PhD philosopher? No, I'm a PhD theologian, focusing on systematic theology and analytic theology. So there's a lot of overlap with philosophy right there, but I'm careful to say I'm not a philosopher. I'm a PhD theologian. However, I am working with 15 other PhD philosophers on this project. So I've made sure to surround myself with good people.
Why don't you just do what William Lane Craig did and go get a second PhD? He's got a PhD in theology and a PhD in philosophy. I mean, come on, what you're slacking, Tim? Come on.
Yeah, maybe someday we'll see about that. But yeah, so okay, since the argument has evolved so much over the past 2 years, I mean, J.P. Moreland and I co-authored an academic journal article together, published in the journal called Religions.
And for those that don't know, and for just interrupt, for those that don't know, that our audience people in the audience may not know of J.P. Moreland, but anybody in the philosophical world, especially as a Christian, knows the name J.P. Moreland. I had the honor of meeting him at one of our conferences he came to speak at, and he is a giant philosophical mind, and I'm sure that was an honor to work with him. It was sure an honor to meet him. I got a copy of his book and had him sign it, and he asked for a copy of mine and asked me to sign it. So,
oh, that's awesome.
So yeah, and so I was honored. I was like, oh, you really? Okay. So anyway, I had to throw that in there. But J.P. Moreland is a huge name in philosophy, and so it's great. Great opportunity to work with him.
He's considered to be in the top 50 philosophers in the world, and that's not just Christian philosophers; that's philosophers in general. Yes. He's ranked in the top 50, according to one survey I saw among philosophers. So yeah, we published that journal article in 2022, and I encourage everybody to read that. It's free online, so you don't have to pay for it. And it's called An Explanation and Defense of the Free Thinking Argument. But here's a version of the argument that I offered in November of 2023. And this was at the last EPS conference in San Antonio. So it goes like this. Premise 1, if naturalistic determinism is true, then human beings lack libertarian freedom. 2, if human beings lack libertarian freedom, then their rational processes are unreliable to attain truth about metaphysical matters. 3, human beings' rational processes are reliable to attain truth about metaphysical matters. 4, therefore, human beings have libertarian freedom. And 5, therefore, naturalistic determinism is false. So Why I think this free thinking argument is sound, that's going to depend on how we define our terms and how I defend the premises. So, Leighton, do you have any questions or comments about any premises or words that you want defined or anything like that?
First things that pop out obviously is naturalistic determinism. How does that differ from, in my world of theology, theistic determinism? Is there a distinction with a difference that should be noted when you specifically say naturalistic determinism?
Mm-hmm. So this argument is laser focused against naturalistic determinism.
Okay, so it's not aimed at our Calvinist friends. It's aimed at the It's aimed at the atheist, the naturalistic determinist. Okay, I just want that to be clear first and foremost before. And I know later on you develop some other things that focus more on theists, but I just wanted to point that out as this argument is really focused, like you said, laser focused on the naturalistic determinist.
Yeah, and that's how it started out in 2012 when I was at Biola. I wanted to take down naturalism, this very common view of that the atheists hold. I wanted to really show that the atheistic, naturalistic worldview is false. And so it amazed me, and by the way, when I first crafted this argument, so many Calvinists were cheering me on and loving it. But then they started realizing some problems, and it was not the atheists or the naturalists that provided the most pushback. It was Calvinists. And we'll see why this is the case as we move forward. But let's hold off on that for a little bit.
Okay, so let me ask about another thing then. Libertarian freedom. Why not just say free will? Why say libertarian freedom?
Because honestly, a lot of Calvinists and other determinists have muddied the waters so much that and say, oh, well, we don't need libertarian freedom. I don't believe in libertarian free will because I've got compatibilistic free will. And so this, it's just, you've got to define everything. So let me do that. Let me go down, I think, what are some of the important terms here, and then I'll let you ask me if there's other terms that you'd like defined either now or as we go on through the conversation. Okay. So let's start with naturalism. What do I mean by that? J.P. Moreland and I, when we wrote our articles, really what I had in mind in my earlier writings, and J.P. encouraged me to say, well, let's use the term robust naturalism, because that was, after all, what I had in mind, but I could have been more clear in the past. So now in our article, we wrote, we're laser focused on robust naturalism, and we're careful to differentiate that idea from what we describe as faint-hearted naturalism. So let me read a footnote from our article. In the footnote, we write, robust naturalism is the idea that only physical things exist. A faint-hearted naturalist, by contrast, is one who helps herself to non-physical or immaterial emergent properties. So we give the faint-hearted naturalist a pass in our article. I got to say that I'm aware of some things that JP is working on right now. He's not going to be so kind to faint-hearted naturalists moving forward. But yeah, the robust naturalism is the idea that there's no non-physical or immaterial minds, and there's definitely no immaterial, that would be too close to God. One way that we've defined robust naturalism is the idea that that God or things like God do not exist. So there would not be any immaterial thinking things that have active causal power in the universe, right? An immaterial mind with the power to cause things or make things happen that's not being determined by something or someone else. That would be too close to God, right? So I'm going after this view that of robust naturalism. God or things like God do not exist. There's not immaterial or non-physical realities, and there's definitely no immaterial minds that can make things happen with it, where the buck stops with them, so to speak. Right. So with that said, the specific argument I'm offering today is specifically dealing with naturalistic determinism. So really, we don't even have to worry about the words robust or faint-hearted. We're just saying, hey, anybody that thinks naturalism and determinism is true, this argument is aimed at you. And I think that would be a vast majority of atheists today. So with that said, what does it mean to be determined? Well, an event is determined if antecedent, and that's a big fancy word for prior, right? So an event is determined if antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate said event, right? So it's a necessary thing. It cannot fail to be the case if the
In other words,
prior
if previous conditions or previous events, previous something happens that is causally determining said event, then that is determinism. In other words, it cannot not happen, so to speak. To use a double negative, I mean, it has to happen because of those preceding events leading up to that point. Is that kind of a way of describing it?
Yeah. I mean, simply put, an event is determined if prior conditions are sufficient to necessitate the event. So it really gets down to necessary, and if something's necessary, it cannot fail. It must be the case. So so I'll get more to that soon. But now let's talk about determinism. Now that typically means the antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate all events, right? Determinism is the idea that these prior conditions are sufficient to determine and necessitate everything in the world. Now, here's the deal. If the quantum realm, quantum mechanics, a lot of people didn't know about quantum mechanics for a long time, but now, all the Marvel comics and DC comic movies are, they're all the quantum realm stuff is going on. So at least people now are, the popular level audiences are familiar with the term quantum realm, but they still don't know really much about it. I mean, they get their ideas about the quantum realm from Ant-Man or something. but if the quantum realm is indeterministic, and that's a big if, there's a lot of debate going on between physicists and philosophers on this matter. But if the quantum realm is indeterministic, then determinism simplicator is not true. It would be false. Not all things in the universe would be determined by prior states. But I don't really care about that. We can still discuss all things about humanity being determined by antecedent conditions, or the laws and events of nature. That's what I will mean when I use the term determinism. I'm really focused about humanity. I don't care about the quantum realm. So to help others who might be confused on this, I like to use the term exhaustive determinism to highlight the fact that we're not merely talking about your physical actions here, but we're talking about the entirety of your mental activity is determined by something else. So I don't really care that much about the quantum realm. I don't care about all of your physical actions. I don't even care about all of your thoughts. I'm laser focused on the entirety. I don't care if some of your thoughts are determined. What I worry about is if the entirety of your mental activity is determined by something else, then, well, as you're going to see, that's going to be a big problem moving forward. Okay. So any other questions on what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like I remember talking to Eric a little bit about this, Eric Hernandez, that we mentioned earlier, and he talks about source libertarianism, which basically sounds like what you're getting at is that the source of your choices is the agent. If the source of the choice is outside the agent, in other words, by antecedent conditions, prior conditions, a divine decree that we'll get into later, or naturalistic events that take place, whatever it may be, then you're not source libertarianly free. In other words, the source of the choice is not really the agent, it's outside the agent. Would that be a proper way of understanding that?
I really think the most important thing here is not talking about the ability to do or think otherwise. I think that is important. And I think it's probably entailed if you're the source, at least a lot of times, not all the time, actually. I can think of some thought experiments where that wouldn't be the case, but it's vital that we are the source. And what I mean by that is the driver of the process of reason. Am I behind the steering wheel? Am I steering the ship? Am I the pilot of the ship of reason? Or am I tied up, gagged, and sitting in the back seat, merely along for the ride, maybe passively aware of how somebody else is driving, but with no control over how he drives? So I'm talking about, am I the pilot? When I say, am I the source? Am I the pilot of the ship of reason? Am I behind the controls, or is something or someone else? And when we're talking about piloting the ship of reason, or our deliberating processes, or the process of rationality, are you piloting through that, or are you a passive cog being driven in the back? Are you in the back seat being driven by somebody or something else? So, yeah, we'll flesh that out more as we move forward.
All right, press on, brother.
All right. So let's talk about libertarian freedom. Or often called libertarian free will. When you hear me use the term free will, I am talking about libertarian free will, or simply put, libertarian freedom. So, lost my train. Okay, so when or under which conditions is an action free or freely performed in the libertarian sense? Well, one condition would be when in the actual world, the person could have refrained from performing a certain action, right? They performed an action, but they could have refrained from it. So in other words, as I noted before, that's the ability to do otherwise, or technically known as the condition of alternative possibilities. And so if somebody has alternative possibilities actually available to them in the real world, then that is sufficient to render an action free in a libertarian sense. So if you can do one thing or do another thing, and both those options are each compatible with your nature at that moment, if you can think one way, if you can take a thought captive or be taken captive by bad thinking, right? As I like to say that difference between Colossians 2:8, where Paul warns us that we can be taken captive by bad thinking, or 2 Corinthians 10:5, we can take thoughts captive to obey Christ, right? If you find yourself in a situation where you can either let bad thinking, sinful thinking, shallow philosophy take you captive, or you can take those bad thoughts captive, and then you've got libertarian free will. Now, and also we could look to 1 Corinthians 10:13. Every time a Christian
that's what I was thinking of.
Every time a Christian is at least tempted to sin, God says that that he will provide a way of escape so that you don't have to sin. So I don't know about you, Leighton, but I still sin on occasion. Probably more than that.
I've gotten past all that sin stuff.
Right. I'm sometimes just disgusted at the things that I do.
This example that I've used before in discussions, like if you lied yesterday, and I always use past tense because it has happened. In just the simple question, you as a Christian, could you have refrained from lying? Right. Mm-hmm. And I think most of us intuitively as Christians would have said, well, of course I could have. That's just I think the natural response. Only in these philosophical discussions and when determinism is entered in, that basic intuitive belief that I could have refrained from lying, that even the fact that is even a question is because Calvinism and determinists have inserted this philosophical way of thinking, which is really not tenable, not livable. Even Calvinist and hard, strict, naturalistic determinists act as if and seem to make decisions as if they're making choices that aren't determined by something other than themselves. Right. It seems to me anyway.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And bottom line for the Christians watching here, if 1 Corinthians 10:13 is true, and every time that a Christian is tempted to sin, God provides a way of escape so they do not have to, then that means that when you do sin as a Christian, which I still do, I could have taken the way of escape and not sinned.
Right.
So I could have done otherwise. I could have refrained from sinning, but I chose to anyway. And that's why I'm responsible in a deserving sense.
Yeah.
But if that's all true, then that's biblical evidence of libertarian freedom. We have libertarian free will,
which is valuable in the devotional side of things, and in the sanctification side of things. I talk about this in my own testimony, because when you adopt even a deterministic way of thinking, then it can be I'm not trying to say all Calvinists do this, but this was my testimony. It can be an excuse for sin. So I became addicted to pornography, for example, or became addicted to drugs, or became addicted to whatever substance or whatever issue that I might be dealing with, because God ordained me to, decreed me to, determined me to, in some supernatural sense that, however it may be defined, even through secondary causes, whatever it is. He's the one who ultimately is the source of my addiction. He is the one who is the decreer of, the cause of, the bringer about of, whatever word you want to use there. And therefore I have a rationalization for what I'm doing. I'm doing this because ultimately my God, my creator, or naturalistic causes throughout history have led me to these decisions and to these addictions that I can't really do anything about apart from God decreeing otherwise, or the naturalistic, mechanical, whatever it is that the naturalists might argue. And that seems to me to be very detrimental to the process of sanctification and personal responsibility for one's, owning one's personal, actions and choices as their own.
Definitely. I've known Calvinists who excuse their sin because they're like, well, I can't help it. I mean, they wouldn't say it like that, but really, you read between the lines, like, well, look what God determined. Well,
I've played them on here. We played from a podcast. One of them saying that, sometimes God gives this thorn in the flesh to even his own elect children, to keep them humble. And he was talking about same-sex attraction and addiction. And he was saying, like, God's given him this thorn in the flesh, this addiction, to keep them humble. And I was just like, oh my goodness, how devastating is it for an addict to hear that? Because what is an addict looking for? They're looking for justification or rationalization for their addiction. And so you've just given it to them. You've just given them the perfect one. I couldn't do otherwise. God created me this way. God made me this way. God gave me this thorn in the flesh.
Yeah, even if God gave him, which I'm not saying that he did, but let's suppose that God gave him the attraction. I mean, I think God gives most men, even most Christian men, we're okay.
I can see the wheels turning, going, where do I want to go with this?
I can see this being turned against me. I was saying, look, we all have desires to do things that are sinful, right? Just because you're a Christian, those don't stop. That doesn't mean I have license to do them. Right? Why? Because I have the free will to say no to those desires. Yeah. So even if
it's what separates us from the animal, it's what separates us from the animal. The cat sleeps around with every cat in the neighborhood. That's right. We don't do that. I mean, we shouldn't be doing that.
Right. Well,
why? Because we have free will. Right.
Yeah. And look, we probably would do that if we didn't have free will, and if we knew. I mean, gosh, if we weren't different than the animals, we would be. But we know that that's not right. Anyway, the big problem here, and one thing I mentioned is I don't have a problem with the word decree. I do. I mean, I'm a Molinist. I believe that God decreed a certain world, but that was a freedom permitting world in which he knew how we would freely choose. Now, even the open theist can affirm the word decree. They believe that God decreed a world into existence in which he doesn't know what will happen with certainty.
Right. Well, yeah, you have to be able to say God decreed that libertarianly free will creatures exist, for example.
Yeah.
So that would be in accordance with his decree then. Yeah.
So the problem isn't the word decree. It is determined. And so if God's decree is deterministic, then that's the problem. If it's a deterministic decree, then it's if God's decree provides the antecedent conditions sufficient to necessitate everything that happens.
Yeah, which is all getting down to the definitions, it sounds like, because just like the word sovereignty doesn't mean determinism, right. But if the Calvinist is using the word sovereignty as if it means determinism, or they're using the word decree as if it means determinism, then that's when we get talking past each other a lot of times, and that's why it's so important to do what you're doing right now, which is to define the terms. By the way, I do see the side chats, and I will be bringing those up. They're starred. We'll bring those up a little bit later after we get through with the presentation portion.
Cool.
So
I'm not looking at the side chats because
good.
It's always
smart move.
Yeah. So let me define some more things. So I mentioned the alternative possibilities, but I think the most important thing, the thing that I'm most focused upon, is being the source of your action. So another sufficient condition of libertarian freedom is when the performance of an action, whether that's a mental action or a physical action, I'm primarily concerned with mental actions. If that's ultimately up to the person as the source in a buck-stopping sense, right? When no factors other than the person necessitate the person's performance, then you've got libertarian freedom. So that is to say, the buck stops with the person and cannot be traced to any preceding deterministic cause. So I think those are some of the most important definitions to get out of the way before I start defending the premises of the free thinking argument that I've just given you. Any other questions on that?
I think we're good. Press on, my friend.
All right. So let's defend premise one. I think this is a pretty easy one to defend. Won't take a lot of time. So the first premise of the version of the free thinking argument offered here, it's worded like this: if naturalistic determinism is true, then humans lack libertarian freedom. Now, this is true by definition. After all, libertarianism is definitionally indeterministic, and naturalistic determinism obviously precludes indeterminism. So,
which is what drives you crazy when you hear somebody try to say, "Oh, I affirm both determinism and libertarian freedom." And you're going, you're not understanding the definitions if you're doing that. But press on.
That's right. So premise one, it's true by definition, and if a premise is true by definition, it's not really under dispute. In fact, when I debated this with Alex Malpass the other day, he quickly agreed. Now, what I like to do, I'm going to say premise two is the key pivotal, or at least the master premise here. So I'm going to skip that one for a second and defend premise three, because I think it's also a pretty easy premise to defend. So the third premise of the argument offered here, and I'll just say in most versions that I've offered in the past, this would be the fourth premise, but the way I've worded it here, it becomes the third. So the third premise, human beings' rational processes are reliable to attain truth about metaphysical matters. That's going to be affirmed by most people, especially people involved in these conversations, because free will, after all, is a metaphysical matter. And we're trying to decide, does free will exist or does it not? Right? So just to be actively engaged in this conversation, these folks are going to affirm it. They're going to say, yeah, we have the ability to attain truth. It might be really hard, but yeah, we do have the ability to gain knowledge about metaphysics and theology, right? So if our cognitive processes were not reliable to do so, then
what's the point in even discussing anything?
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So
this premise that's basically what it ends up being. If you deny premise three, then you're pretty much saying there is no way for us to attain truth or even to understand any aspect of truth. So in a sense, why even bother? I mean, it seems like
I'm not talking about,
you would have to.
And I'll say this: in my early days of advancing this argument, I was probably too aggressive, and thankfully, guys like Guillaume being on, I think, pointed some things out, because, and obviously I knew what I meant by this, but man, these guys have helped me to be much more clear
to hone it in. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And it's because, he started talking about, or we're talking about I can infer, even if I'm, even if there's no free will, he can still rationally infer that his wife just baked bread in the kitchen or something along those lines. And so finally I started to say, I used to say, like, just you can't have rationality or knowledge, full stop. Now I'm like, all right, look, let's grant that you can know if your wife just baked bread in the kitchen, or that you can have knowledge of how to cross the street without getting run over, or you can develop tiger avoidance behavior and things like that. I'm laser focused now with the help of JP on metaphysical and theological beliefs. So everybody involved in these discussions are also focused on metaphysical and theological beliefs. And you'll see this in my debate with Alex Malpass. He pushed back on this premise quite a bit. And then if memory serves, I need to watch it again, but if memory serves, he winds up, once we finally get everything defined properly, he's like, oh yeah, okay, I agree with that. So again, one thing that Jacobus Erasmus, and he's a philosopher out of South Africa, looks like Jacobus. What a cool name, Jacobus Erasmus. Yeah. But we write this in our forthcoming essay. We say, talking about this third premise, we say, indeed, this premise is so intuitively obvious, so basic a belief, so intimate and dear and beneficial to us that no one, except perhaps the most dramatic of skeptics, would deny it without a passionate struggle. And so we think that, when you're faced between a choice between either one, the reliability of your rational processes to infer best explanations and to attain truth about metaphysical matters, or two, naturalistic determinism, which would be a metaphysical matter, it seems rational that naturalistic determinism should be the one discarded. So that one's really a pretty easy premise to defend. Most people, in fact, don't ask for it to be defended.
It reminds me of whenever somebody says you can't, no one knows truth. Is that a truth?
Yeah, right.
Is that true? That it sounds like that's what premise 3 ultimately is saying. If you're denying that premise, then how do you even know that your denial of it is true? You can't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's it becomes
it's a self-defeating argument.
Yeah. One of our former students at Trinity has recently come out and say, well, you can deny that premise. You can be skeptical of that premise. I'm like, sure, you can deny it and you can be skeptical, but you cannot rationally deny it and you cannot rationally be skeptical of it. You definitely can't rationally argue against it, because to do so proves that it's true. And so it's just one of those things. It's like if I said nobody ever speaks English. Well, I've just demonstrated that statement is false. And so, I mean, like I said, I think in the history of defending this argument for the last dozen years, I can count on one hand how many people have rejected that premise. Typically atheists, but not always. But it's usually after I've defended the preceding premises so well that they realize, okay, those are strong. The only way to avoid the conclusion that they don't want to be true is by avoiding their own rationality. That just doesn't just change. Let it go. That's the epitome of irrationality. I've said it before. We should expect that. I mean, when I see Christians do it because they don't want this argument to pass, I say, guys, that's what we should expect from the citizens of hell. They'd rather affirm their own irrationality than to affirm the existence of God. That's not what we should see from Christians. So anyway, I think the master premise here is the second premise. If this argument is going to fail, it's going to be this premise that needs to be defeated. So it needs a little bit more unpacking, and I probably won't do it all here because I know you want to go to the deity of deception argument. But I'll give you a little bit. I'll tell you, if people want to see this one defended in more depth and detail, watch my debate on Unbelievable with Alex Malpass. And just spend time on my website.
The link is in the show notes for those that have just joined. The link is in the show notes for that debate if you're wanting to watch it on YouTube. So, all right.
And I just published an article called The Freethinking Argument for Beginners. So if this feels like it's going over your head, go to my website at freethinkinc.org. That's freethinkinc.org, or freethinkingministries.com. Both will get you there. And the last article I just published was the free thinking argument for beginners, and it's even illustrated by Adam Ford. So, so take a look at that. Also, my YouTube channel, Free Thinking Ministries, I just talk about this all the time.
And the website is also for free thinking, is also in the show notes for those that want to link to that. And if you haven't subscribed to Tim Stratton's broadcast and the free thinking broadcast, you need to do that. There's a lot of really good things, especially those that want to go deeper. As many of you know that follow me on this page, there's not a lot of in-depth philosophical discussions because my capacity to take us down that road is not always there. So I have to have guests on like Tim and others to take us down those roads. And so if you want to go down those roads, that's a great place to subscribe. So be sure to do that before you leave this page, is to go to his page afterwards and watch that debate, and also subscribe to his broadcast.
Yeah. On YouTube, it's just search for Free Thinking Ministries and you'll find us. But thank you for that plug, Leighton. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. No,
maybe
pleasure.
maybe someday I might have like 1/10 of your subscribers. You've done amazing work.
You have a lot of good stuff. You get a lot of good stuff. All right, press on with number 2. Give us a defense of number 2, and then let's move on to the next one.
Okay. So the process of reasoning, or one's use of reason, is clearly a sequence of actions. When you're thinking things through, it's a step-by-step process. But is this process free, or is it sometimes free? Now, I've invented a character that I call Phil the Philosopher. So he's our imaginary thinker, and he spends the afternoon. All right, imagine Phil spending the afternoon trying to figure out if we've got free will in a libertarian sense, or if everything is determined, and he's going to get to the bottom of this. So Phil spends the afternoon weighing the arguments, both for and against the existence of human libertarian freedom, which is a metaphysical matter. And he concludes, after the afternoon of thinking about this deeply, he concludes by inferring that humans lack this libertarian freedom, and also that naturalistic determinism is true. Now, given his conclusions and beliefs, Phil now faces a difficulty. How can he trust his reasoning? If Phil's reasoning was determined, then that means he could not have refrained from performing that exact manner of how he reasoned. And it's impossible that he even could have arrived at a different inference or conclusion about reality. All right, there's nothing he could have done to hold a different belief that was not under his control or within his power. After all, some factors external to him, these antecedent prior conditions, determined him and necessitated him to reason exactly the way he did and to arrive at the specific conclusion and his specific belief. So then how can Phil trust this reasoning process and be rationally justified in his inference that humans lack libertarian freedom and that determinism is true? Well, two possibilities to consider here. The first one is this: if Phil has good reasons for this, is going to get a little bit philosophical here. So if Phil has good reasons for thinking that the external factors determining his mind processes and his reasoning process are reliable to determine him to attain truth regarding metaphysical matters, then his trust in his inference regarding metaphysics would be justified. And most epistemologists and philosophers are going to tell you that for a belief, or for you to have knowledge of something, you've got to have justification for it. Right? There's other things you need, but you've got to have justification. That means a good reason and no defeater to that belief. But here's the problem. Phil would then be led into a viciously regressive reasoning because he cannot reason that the external factors determining his reasoning processes are reliable until he has reasoned that the external factors determining his reasoning processes are reliable. So we're getting circular here, and that's a horrid, nasty, unwelcome situation that nobody wants to be in. So it's not a good option to do that. So how else can Phil the philosopher trust in his metaphysical conclusions? Well, another possibility is that, if Phil's belief in the reliability, or even the general reliability, in his reasoning abilities to infer truth about metaphysical and theological matters is a basic belief. And two, if he has no defeater for this belief, then his trust in this reasoning process would be justified. Now, it seems that belief in the reliability of human reasoning is a basic belief, right? Everybody believes that that they have the ability to reason correctly, to infer best explanations about things, even about ultimate reality if they're careful. However, in Phil's case, if he affirms this naturalistic deterministic view and its corollary that humans lack libertarian free thinking, then Phil faces a defeater for his belief in the reliability of his reasoning abilities. And here's why. Phil's belief in naturalistic determinism, coupled with certain human experiences, provides him a huge defeater against his belief. And if he's got a huge defeater, then he's not justified, and therefore he doesn't know what he's talking about. So here's why. I'm almost done with this. Experience shows that multiple humans, including epistemic peers, right, PhD theologians and PhD metaphysicians, all right, epistemic peers can evaluate the same evidence or arguments, but arrive at different conclusions, and that we can strongly disagree with each other's arguments and their premises, and weigh the premises differently, that one's reasoning can be faulty, and that we sometimes change our minds about an argument. I mean, Leighton, you and I agree on a lot, but would you say is it fair to say that we don't agree on everything?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sure we do. I mean, I look at William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, the two guys that have influenced me probably more than anybody else, and I find things that I disagree with them, and I explain why.
I don't know any two philosophers or theologians that agree on every single matter,
right,
by any means, right?
And for that matter, I agree with James White on a few things.
Just a few.
Just a few, even though I think he gets a whole bunch of things wrong, right? But look, yeah, we're all there's disagreement all over the place by those in these fields, not just theological or theology, but also in metaphysics and philosophy. Even among atheistic philosophers, they're disagreeing on stuff all over the place. So these situations, if they're determined by external factors, well, those same factors appear to be rather clumsy at producing consistent reasoning processes, especially when it comes to metaphysics and theology. So why should we trust those antecedent conditions? Why should Phil trust his rational faculties on these metaphysical matters? Why should Phil think that these external factors have determined him to reason soundly, and those who disagree with him to reason unsoundly? I mean, talk about begging the question, right, if he does that, right? What makes Phil so special that these naturalistic events, mindless antecedent conditions that know nothing about metaphysics and could care less if Phil knows anything about metaphysics, would determine Phil to arrive at true metaphysical beliefs and his critics to arrive at erroneous conclusions, right? We start to see the big problem here is that these antecedent conditions on naturalistic determinism are mindless, non-rational. They know nothing about metaphysics, and they could care less if humans know anything about metaphysics. And yet these things, this mindless stuff, is determining the entirety of our minds and our thoughts about metaphysics. That's no reason to think your beliefs about metaphysics are true. In fact, it's a huge reason to doubt it. So I have a whole bunch more I could say about this. The biggest problem here is that mindless stuff that knows nothing about metaphysics would be sufficient to necessitate Phil's metaphysical beliefs. And that's called a defeater against Phil's metaphysical beliefs. So much more to say about that, but this is really the crux of the problem with naturalistic determinism.
So what would you say? I'm curious what you would say to Brenton. He's a Calvinist on the side chat. And I think this will give you an opportunity to engage with one person before we move on to the next section. He says, it sounds to me that Tim is admitting that all of these philosophers operating out of their libertarian free will disagree, meaning their LFW, their libertarian free will, is unreliable. How would you respond to that argument?
Well, libertarian freedom isn't something that's reliable or unreliable. Libertarian freedom is needed when what would otherwise be sufficient to necessitate the entirety of your mental processes is untrustworthy.
In other words, when someone gets it wrong, they're getting it wrong freely, not because they were determined to get it wrong.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about
this.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about this more as we go forward. Was that Brenton? Is that his name?
Yeah, Brenton.
If he would read my journal article co-authored with Dr. J.P. Moreland, he would see that his
linked in the show notes as well. That article is linked in the show notes.
Yeah. His objection is handled. If we don't get there today, remind me to get back and I'll explain exactly why it's handled. But in the last article I wrote on my website, called The Free Thinking Argument for Beginners, I make it crystal clear. So read my academic works where I've contributed to the literature, or go to my website and read a blog for beginners. We're going to answer your question there, but I hope to get to that more today with you, Leighton. Let's I think we should kind of transition now, and because I know you really wanted to kind of focus on the problems with divine determinism, right?
Absolutely. So this is where it gets into your deity of deception argument.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And really, I guess before we get going, this was an offshoot of the free thinking argument. As I was thinking about how to defeat naturalism, I soon realized, wow, just replace the words naturalistic determinism with divine determinism, and you're going to wind up having the same problems, if not worse problems. Now, with that said, I also want to thank the Calvinists who have pushed back against the free thinking argument, because I think they've really helped me to see these things, and then allowed me the opportunity to expose these problems. Look, even though Guillaume Bignon and I disagree on these things, I said it before, I'm so thankful for his pushback. I'm even, and really, I should say that as I was preparing for my debate against James White back in 2021, it was my first debate ever. I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds that James White has had, but I look at him as like one of the best. I mean, you've debated him, and I think you've got one coming up with him. He's a heavyweight, right? He's a heavyweight when it comes to debate. He's done so many of them. I disagree with most of his positions, but I agree with them sometimes. But as I was preparing for that debate, the first initial iteration of, or version of, what has now become the deity of deception argument was offered in my opening speech. So if people want to see, and by the way, let me just point out that I offered several arguments in my opening speech that James White never addressed. Well, we might talk about that more later, but it was that debate where people could see where I was first starting to really kind of put meat on the bones of this, what's now become the deity of deception argument. So let's talk about divine determinism a little bit. Unless you have any other comments to make.
No, I was just going to say, if those search your name and that debate, we did some follow-up videos after that debate and kind of talk through it as well. So that those that want to catch up and see some of the ways in which those comes out. And sometimes, so much of the time, debates become games of rhetoric and sidestepping issues. And James White is really good with the rhetorical side, not the content side, in my estimation. I think you handedly beat him on content. I think he beat you on rhetoric. Meaning that he came across as more assured of himself, more comfortable in his shoes, which is natural when you've done hundreds of debates. You're a lot more calm, cool, collected in a debate setting. And so rhetorically, you can sidestep issues almost like a politician. A really good politician is usually someone who's really good at rhetoric and at sidestepping the press's questions, refocusing upon reframing the discussion. White is a master at that.
Yeah,
which is great for his audience and those who support him because they're able to cheer him on in his rhetorical banter. But what I think is important is to look past the rhetoric into the content in any of these discussions. And some that he's debated, I think Steve Gregg, for example, handled him not only rhetorically but also with content. And so go back and listen. Michael Brown probably too. Both of those guys were really good with their rhetoric as well as their content. And that's where I think you and I are both trying to shore up our rhetoric skills when it comes to debate, because both of us are learning that as we go along, kind of thrown into the deep end of the pool by our first debates being with Dr. White. But that's a part of the process.
Right. And I have no problem with rhetoric as long as the rhetoric is honest and
isn't avoiding. Yeah.
It's not avoiding the issues. I try to be I try to use rhetorical skills. Some people don't like my rhetoric, but what I'm trying to do, I try. So I argue for everything academically, and then I try to use rhetoric to paint that picture, to make it clear to perhaps those who are new to it or following along or whatever. I think rhetoric is important, and to James White's credit, he's really good at it. And like you said, you and I are trying to get better. But what's most important, as you noted, is content. And if I was asked before that debate, hey, you've got to win one of these and lose one of these. Do you want to win content or rhetoric? And I'll say I'll take the content every time. Day.
Yes, absolutely. Right? Yeah, so. and I used to judge debates. We did cross-examination debates for years in high school and college, and then later I went back and judged for several years. And they have the speaker point side where you're giving them based upon their presentation, and then you have the content, the flow. And so that's something you have to learn to do when you debate, coach debates, and you judge debates. And so that's what I was saying before. On the rhetoric side, I would have given him more speaker points than you, just because of his calm demeanor, and he seemed to have good rhetoric skills. On you, I'd have put almost all the content stuff was on your side, because I was able to recognize he wasn't engaging with many of the points and arguments you were making. And that's not to say that you didn't have good rhetoric too. I think you had some good rhetoric too. It's just in comparison to someone who's a seasoned debater, it just comes across like one of them's more assured of themselves or has all the all the answers. And for an audience that is rooting for one person or isn't aware of the philosophical language or the points, a lot of times the average layperson doesn't know how to even follow the line of argument, because they haven't studied the things enough to even understand the arguments in order to follow them. And so all you need is rhetoric. All that person, the average layman, needs is the rhetoric to make them feel good about whatever position they already, support coming into the debate. But for those of us who are free thinkers, deep thinkers, we want more. We want content. We want to understand the reasons behind the discussion, the reason behind the debate. But we can go off on that tangent forever. I want to get to this argument regarding EDD, which is obviously exhaustive divine determinism, and kind of unpack that for us, and then explain this argument and why it's so important with regard to how we confront Calvinism.
Yeah. So I call it exhaustive divine determinism, or ED, EDD or ED, just to highlight the fact that we're talking about if this view is true, that it seems to me that a majority of Calvinists hold, especially those in academia, then God is determining everything about you, including the entirety of your mental activity. So I don't care about, like I said, I don't care if quantum mechanics is indeterministic. If you're determined and the entirety of your mental activity is determined by someone else, then there's going to be problems exposed here. So, and C.S. Lewis anticipated something similar in his argument against naturalism, and he brought God into the mix here. And he said something like, "Couldn't I be merely?" Let me got this here. Couldn't I be merely a natural being whose reasoning is really God performing reasoning through me, similar to how an electric current passes through a wire.
Mm-hmm.
And J.P. Moreland and I talk about this quite a bit in our academic journal article as well, about being an active. Are you somebody that can practice active analysis, or are you a passive? Are you deliberating? Are you deliberating, or are sensations of deliberating passing through you, caused by something or someone else? So let me read what C.S. Lewis said here. He said, the traditional doctrine that I am a creature to whom God has given reasons, but who is distinct from God, seems to me much more philosophical than the theory that what appears to be my thinking is only God's thinking through me. On the latter view, it's very difficult to explain what happens when I think correctly but reach a false conclusion because I've been misinformed about the facts. Why God, who presumably knows the real facts, is omniscient after all, should be at the pains to think one of his perfectly rational thoughts through a mind in which it's bound to produce error, I do not understand. So I think he's starting to see the problem here. And I think J.P. Moreland and I really, we stood on his shoulders and really explained why C.S. Lewis was right decades ago.
You really can't call C.S. Lewis a very deep thinker, though. Come on.
Right. Gee whiz.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it was Victor Reppert, a philosopher, who kind of pointed out that C.S. Lewis is often unjustly dismissed because he wasn't a professional PhD philosopher. Neither are you, or I'm not, you're not, right? But a lot of philosophers just kind of dismiss him. But he did teach, excuse me, he did teach philosophy, I believe, at Oxford. So he's training up and coming philosophers. But what Victor Reppert said is he might not have been an official philosopher, but C.S. Lewis's philosophical instincts were off the chart, right? Probably
his intellect was off the chart, and even by Calvinist's own admission, I mean, the guy is in a league of his own with regard to his thinking and his way of processing. So, if nothing else, the point is that the reason I cite from William Lane Craig and Lewis and Tozer and all these other guys that are well respected among the theologians and scholars is because I know little old Leighton, who cares, but if I can present someone who they recognize as a deep thinker, has come to the same conclusions far before I was even born, then what I'm doing is I'm trying to help you to evaluate these arguments, not because the anti-Calvinist, whatever you think about me, Leighton Flowers on Soteriology 101 is saying these things. These are things that have been argued for not only centuries, but from the beginning, even before Christ walked the earth. There were these kinds of arguments going on among philosophers and theologians of the like. So I want to inform the audience and help them to understand these things. So I think bringing in C.S. Lewis is a wonderful way of accomplishing that purpose.
Well, thank you. And what's really cool is if the arguments that J.P. Moreland and I have advanced, if they're sound, and it seems to me that they are, and they're standing strong against pushback from everybody, and they seem to be getting stronger. If these arguments are sound, that debate that's been going on for millennia, it's over.
You solved it.
What's that? Yeah, we solved it.
Yeah, you solved it.
Yeah, if we're right, the debate's over. Yep. Big if, but I think we're right. But I think that's also why some folks take this so personally and get so emotionally heated. They disagree. They don't. It's because they've already attached their cart to this deterministic view, or either naturalistic determinism or divine determinism, and they're emotionally attached. And so the response to these arguments is often vitriolic and emotional. And we've got to tear down Tim Stratton. He's not a good person, you see. So it's, it's just crazy that even Christians would act like that. But anyway, Lewis's response that I just read, it applies to what I call exhaustive divine determinism, or that ED. the view that every event or state of affairs that is apart from God is determined by God, especially when it comes to human mental activity. So divine determinism implies, of course, that God exhaustively determines then our reasoning processes. And then when we reason correctly, that was determined by God. And when we reason incorrectly, God, that was determined by God. So I'm not saying that we don't do things out of reasons or that we're even aware of reasons. Right? I get pushback from that all the time. I'm saying the manner in which you reasoned, or you might be aware of some reasons. Well, people do things for stupid reasons all the time. People believe false things about reality that are false for reasons all the time. So I'm talking about the manner in which we deliberate and reason in a step-by-step manner to reach our conclusions. Is that determined by you? Or is that determined by something untrustworthy, whether it be mindless antecedent conditions or, as we will see, deceptive supernatural beings? Right? If it's mindless antecedent conditions or deceptive supernatural beings that determine everything that you think and ultimately all that you believe, then you have reason to doubt, or at least I have reason to doubt your thoughts and beliefs. Right? A rational person, let's talk about Joe. If Joe claims that the entirety of his mental activity, including all his philosophical thoughts and metaphysical beliefs and theological beliefs, are determined by either mindless stuff or deceptive deities, then you and I at least have reason to doubt what comes out of Joe's mouth. And here's the other thing. If God is exhaustively determining our reasoning processes, whether they be correct or incorrect, and our what we deem to be rational judgments, whether they're true or false, and our beliefs, and even either our pure thoughts or our wicked thoughts. And we are not the things, we are not the beings who take thoughts captive, right?
Yeah.
God decides if shallow philosophy
which
will
thought
take us captive.
exactly.
Right. Yeah. It's not up to us. God decides if we'll be taken captive by bad thinking or if sensations of us taking thoughts captive will occur. But we're not doing it. We're being driven by him or something else. But I'm not driving that ship. So now, speaking of Calvinist philosopher Paul Helm, who many Calvinists see as the guy when it comes to a Calvinistic philosopher, he says this, 1 second, quote, "Not only is every atom and molecule, every thought and desire kept in being by God, but every twist and turn of each of these is under the direct control of God. He has not, as far as we know, delegated that control to anyone else." End quote. And likewise, John Frame, he says that God brings about our free decisions. He does not foreordain merely what happens to us, but also what we choose to do. And this implies that God does, in fact, bring about the sinful behavior of human beings, if he's right. Or as Heath White, not to be confused with James White, says, one, the facts about God's will wholly determine every other contingent fact. And two, the facts about God's will explain every other contingent fact. So he's saying that God's will, God provides the antecedent conditions sufficient to necessitate your false beliefs, your bad reasoning processes, your sinful thoughts, your sinful actions, right? So unlike naturalistic determinism, divine determinism fully explains and necessitates all of our thoughts, actions, beliefs, and behaviors. And I think this is a problem. Now, there's many issues with that type of response, but if divine determinism were true, then, I mean, think about this. It would have been God who determined the rebellion of his creatures in the first place. God determines your rebellion? What does that even mean? I mean, the very concept of rebellion seems, I wrote this, seems evacuated of its meaning on divine determinism. What does it even mean for a thing determined to act in a particular way to be in rebellion? Isn't it acting exactly as it was caused to? it just, I mean, it just doesn't even make any sense. And also, if we were going to say that God is determining rebellion, I mean, first of all, the person isn't rebelling. It also doesn't seem to be consistent with God's all loving, all good, and all wise nature. So anyway, according to divine determinism, I think it's worse off than naturalistic determinism. They're both bad. In fact, I just gave this talk at the Evangelical Philosophical Society meeting in San Antonio back in November of 2023, just a couple months ago now. And I gave a talk. The whole talk was about how naturalistic determinism has big problems. Divine determinism has bigger problems. And, you know, naturalistic determinism faces, well, no, I'll just say divine determinism is worse than naturalistic determinism because it faces both. One, the issue of undercutting our trust and the reliability of our reasoning processes, which naturalistic determinism does too. But it also has the issue of implicitly leading to an understanding of God as a deity of deception. So I'll pause here because I'm about to get into that argument. So what do you think, Leighton?
Well, and those that listen know that I have been ridiculed by White for continually saying, I guess I've been determined to be wrong.
Right.
And people are saying, why do you do this? Why do you talk back to God? Why do you produce these shows? Why do you start Soteriology 101? Why do you fight against God? If what you're saying is true, because God determined me to.
Yeah.
And they take that as a cop out or as a joke or how dare you, or some of them react in all these different ways. And I'm just like, I'm just restating what you say is true. And it's a layman way of making the free thinking argument. It's basically what I'm doing is I'm just saying, guys, you're getting on to me and you're blaming me for this as if I have something to do with it, which I believe I do, because on my view, I have libertarian freedom. And so if I'm mistaken on any theological belief, it's my fault. I don't think God's decreed for me to have false theology. And then some people push back like White and others. And, you know, that's not what we're saying. We don't believe that you're, you know, this way. And I'm going, okay, well, the guys who know what they're talking about in the philosophical world just come right out and say it like this.
Exhaustively describe reality. Okay. So determinism isn't the thesis that some things are determined. It's the view that all things are determined. And we'll get back to that because that matters in some of the formulation of the arguments.
Okay, well, this raises a question then. So did God causally determine Calvinists like Kokel, Crisp, Muller, etc., to disagree with you?
The answer is yes. All things are determined. So yes, God did causally determine that.
Okay, and it also raises another question. Leighton, you and I both used to be Calvinists, they say, right? They claim to be Calvinists back then,
right? That's fine. And I can take that as their word. I didn't know them. I don't have any reason to doubt that they were sincere Calvinists in the past. But yes, to answer that question, again, he's asking, well, that raises a big question, a conundrum somehow for the Calvinist. Okay. Did God determine us to leave Calvinism? And yes, I take them at their word. I say, yes, God determined that too. Determinism means all is determined. So just get this out of the way. Determinism means that everything is determined.
So it makes no sense to ask, well, did God determine that? Yes.
Yes. Okay. The answer is yes.
Okay, and so that's the way that a Calvinist needs to respond to, has God determined for Leighton Flowers to deny Calvinism? Yes. On your system, that's exactly what he did. And apparently, people like Dr. Bing-Yang think that God has morally sufficient reasons for doing that. I can't imagine what they would be. I can't imagine what why would he make me a subpar Christian by making me a non-Calvinistic Christian? And why would he decree for me to start a broadcast standing against determinism and, soteriological Calvinism? Why would he do that to his child? Yeah. This is one of the reasons it does seem to me that, though I hate and abhor the fact that there are Calvinists out there who don't think I'm a Christian, who think I'm lost and all those kinds of things, as much as I hate that, in some ways they're being more philosophically logical by calling me an unbeliever, because at least on their view, they're not saying I'm like God irresistibly decreed for you to believe in Jesus, but for whatever reason, he didn't go ahead and go all the way and cause you to believe in Calvinistic Christianity.
Yeah.
Why not? Why would God have subpar Christians that he doesn't determine to accept his determinism?
Yeah.
If these views are so important that the Calvinists think that they are, and they're so valuable to your Christian walk and your Christian life, as the Christians often argue they are, that they're the very gospel, the heart of the gospel, are these soteriological points of tulip. Why would he determine for so many of his Christian people throughout Christian history? Why would he determine for us to deny those things? And it sounds like that's exactly what this deity of deception argument is getting to, right?
Yeah. And I want to say, I mean, that video clip that you played from Eli Ayala's show, that was actually in response to you and me and Braxton Hunter.
Braxton. Yes.
Yeah. And they did an interview where Eli was asking Guillaume questions about each of our views. And
yeah. Matter of fact, the I that he was reading from was your quote. And so when he said that I used to be a Calvinist, he was referring to your quote. So he was actually that was directly in response to your quote.
I remember that. I remember I was out out with my wife when we came home, and I saw that was on. And so I started texting Eli, because we're friends, and I was texting him like, ask him this, ask him this. And so, yeah, that was straight from my text to Eli. If memory serves, that was a while ago now. But when, and I had some of these ideas forming back then related to the free thinking argument. But when Guillaume said that, and you picked up on it quickly, that really, I was like, wow, okay, because I'm not just saying the problem here isn't just that Leighton Flowers disagrees. I was pointing out all these other Calvinists who disagree with him. So now we're going to see, okay, on his view, God necessitates and determines not just all humans to get metaphysical and theological beliefs wrong. He determines all Christians to get these important matters wrong. And moreover, he determines all Calvinists to get these important things wrong. They're disagreeing with each other on theological matters. So I think that provides the big problem. And ultimately, I tried to flesh this out in my debate with James White, and it's ultimately led to what J.P. Moreland and I published on the deity of deception argument. So let's see. You've got the argument up. Let's just go through it here. Premise one: if exhaustive divine determinism, or ED, is true, then God determines all Christians, including all Calvinists, to affirm some false theological beliefs. 2, if God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive and his word cannot be trusted. 3, God is not deceptive and his word can be trusted. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
4, these are deductive conclusions now. 4, therefore, God does not determine all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. And 5, therefore, exhaustive divine determinism is false. So this is a pretty strong argument. The idea that a deity of deception determines or fully explains whether we will believe true propositions or not is just as epistemically damaging as the idea of non-rational forces, mad scientists, or evil demons determining if we will believe true propositions or not. Just because a deity is replacing the word demon, for example, I mean, we'd all think that we had big problems if a demon was determining the entirety of our mental activity. Why? Because demons are deceptive and can't be trusted to deliver us truth on theological matters, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, replace
which by the way, you mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier. He actually has a quote that I've read quite regularly, and I think you've quoted it too, where he actually talks about total depravity, this concept and idea that we can't rationally know truth because of our nature from birth. And he's saying that if his black is our white, we can worship we know not what, and this doctrine ends up making God into, might as well worship an all-powerful demon. He calls it an omnipotent fiend.
Yeah.
So that's basically the same argument he's making in a narrative.
Yeah, I've referenced that in other writings, referenced the omnipotent fiend. And it's, so highly influenced. I say that I stand on the shoulders of the giant C.S. Lewis. And what's funny, just a quick side note, is my first development of the free thinking argument. And I was halfway through my master's thesis before I even knew that C.S. Lewis offered the argument from reason. And then I started seeing how similar they were, but I saw the slight differences. And I think now, I've said this, that I think J.P. Moreland and I were able to show exactly why C.S. Lewis was right. C.S. Lewis's arguments have been unjustly dismissed for decades. And I think we've been able to show why C.S. Lewis was right. So, and we've had conversations about this in this new book we're working on with the C.S. Lewis Institute. And they're pretty excited because we're validating C.S. Lewis's work here. But anyway, I don't want to get off on that tangent.
Yeah.
But
so, look, the first premise, let me just jump in there and say the first premise has already been established by Bing-Yang. He pretty much just said that that's true. God determines even Leighton to reject Calvinism, and they believe Calvinism is true. So they're affirming that that all Christians affirm some false theological beliefs by God's determination. So number one's been established. What about number two? Is there pushback on that one?
Yeah, if God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive and his word cannot be trusted. Let's replace it with demon, right? If a demon determines all Christians to affirm false theological beliefs, then the demon is deceptive. And what the demon says cannot be trusted. And what comes out of your mouth can't be trusted. Right? Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
and the demon would be the one to blame, wouldn't he? So if the demon had the power, to deceive every single person that ever lived to believe a false thing, and therefore every single person believed a false thing, whatever that demon determined them to believe, then the people are victims and the demon is the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And the demon is to be blamed, and the demon is obviously deceptive because he's causing every one of us in the world to believe a false thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't see how you get around the logic of that.
Yeah. And why we would have problems with a demon determining all of our metaphysical and theological beliefs is because a demon is deceptive, right? I mean, those two go hand in hand, right? You can't trust demons. Why?
Yeah.
Because they're not trustworthy. Well, I mean, after all, Satan is referred to the father of lies, right? So now what happened? I mean, you get to Lewis's omnipotent fiend here, or what I call a deity of deception. If God determines all Christians to affirm false theological beliefs, every one of them, then God is deceptive, right? So now we're saying that God...
Let me make a clarification. Tim is not saying that God does determine all Christians to believe everything that's false or all false things. Yeah. In other words, God's determining Christians to believe true things too, but he's also determining Christians to believe some false thing, because everybody has at least one false theological belief. Everybody has to admit, because nobody agrees on every single point. So every one of us have some kind of a false understanding of theology or of God, of metaphysics in some way. All of us have some error. And what you're saying is that if we have some error, which we all would admit we do, then God must have been the one who determined for us to hold to that error. Mm-hmm. And therefore he would be a deceptive deity to do that. Yeah. I just wanted to restate that real clearly.
Part of what, philosophers care about is examining what we believe, and then more importantly, why we believe it. And if ultimately the answer to the why we believe it is that antecedent either mindless or deceptive antecedent conditions were sufficient to necessitate my belief, then that's a defeater to that belief. And let me say some things that Victor Reppert has said here that brings up. I mean, just, to your point, I like to say, if it's good for a deceptive demon, it's good for a deceptive deity. Just because a deity is replacing the word demon, for example, the problem doesn't go away. The deity, we cannot say that God determines all Christ followers, let alone everybody else, to get things about theology wrong. That God determines all of his followers to get things wrong about theology, metaphysics, and ultimate reality. That's who you're worshiping. That's why I say this is a low view of God. It's not worthy of the word God at all. God is a maximally great being, the God of truth, not a deceptive deity. But if it's good for a deceptive demon, it's good for a deceptive deity. So here's what Victor Reppert says. He says, this is as epistemically damaging as the brain in the vat hypothesis. Under these hypotheses, we will believe the truth only if a powerful being whose motives are either wicked or incomprehensible chooses that we should believe the truth and not otherwise. These theses are, in C.S. Lewis's view, equally as self-refuting as is naturalism, end quote. So the deity of deception argument shows that divine determinists not only have the same problems as naturalistic determinists, they have them for different reasons. Instead of mindless antecedent conditions, it's God, or supernatural entities, right? The problems are much worse for the divine determinists, though, because not only do the divine determinists lose, they don't have access to the claim that they worship a God of truth. They also, so they lose. I can't talk. I'm getting all my thoughts messed up. Let me back up. Okay. So divine determinists not only lose epistemic responsibility if they're going to say that God determines the entirety of their mental activity. Naturalists have that problem too, but they no longer have access to claim that they worship a God of truth who can be trusted to lead them to truth. And moreover, if the same deity who determines all of his followers to affirm some false theological beliefs also inspired the words of Scripture, then defeaters are raised against the words of Scripture, including the same passages of Scripture appealed to in order to support divine determinism. So if that's the case, you got to see the entire project crumbles, right? The whole thing falls apart. There's no foundation, right? You don't even have a building built on a foundation. No, the foundation is destroyed. Indeed, the problems quickly become much worse for the Calvinist who affirms exhaustive divine determinism. So I've got another argument. With the deity of deception argument in place, we can build upon it with an adapted version of C.S. Lewis's argument from reason. And I call this the justified theological beliefs versus Ed argument. There you go. Okay, so premise one, no theological belief is justified if it's fully explained by untrustworthy antecedent conditions. 2, if Ed is true, then all theological beliefs are fully explained by untrustworthy antecedent conditions. 3, therefore, if Ed is true, then no theological belief is justified. 4, Ed is a theological belief. 5, therefore, a belief that Ed is true is not justified. So, JBS Haldane, I believe he was an atheist. He pointed out a problem and he said, look, let me read it. He said, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms, end quote. Mm-hmm. Well, with Haldane's words in mind, let me rephrase it. I like to say this. If my mental processes, which form my theological beliefs, are determined wholly by a deity of deception, even if the deity has morally sufficient reasons to deceive all humanity, then I have no reason to suppose my theological beliefs are true. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my mental processes are determined by a deity of deception. Mm-hmm. And again, Victor Reppert said that, quote, if the truth of one's belief makes it unjustified, that surely would make the belief a prime candidate for rejection, end quote. So as the previous argument demonstrates, if God determines all things, then the belief that God determines all things is not justified. Thus, a rational and reasonable person ought to reject it. And to make matters worse, if Ed is true, then no theological belief is justified. And to speak French, this is the coup de grace, right? Guillaume would probably say I pronounced that wrong, but this is the coup de grace against those who affirm exhaustive divine determinism. If no theological belief is justified, then no conclusions derived from Scripture are justified. Let that sink in. There's no assurance of salvation on that view or anything else. After all, if one's view entails that God is a deity of deception or an untrustworthy source of theological beliefs, then why should we trust anything this deity says, writes, or inspires?
Right. So how do you know he hasn't? How does he know he hasn't determined you to believe you're chosen and you're saved? And he's determined you to be one of those people who cry out, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and perform any miracles?" And he says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." How do you know he hasn't determined you to believe you're saved when you're really not? And you won't know until you get to heaven, because if he's that kind of deity, the kind of deity that determines people to think they're saved when they're really not, then how can you possibly know you're not one of those people? It's impossible.
And
so
I know you're
how do you even know you're elect?
I know you're talking about Calvinism, but you know who has the exact same beliefs? Muslims, right? That view, it's not the Christian view. I mean, Jesus says, "I am the truth," John 14:6. And in 1 Timothy 2:4, that makes it clear that God desires all people, word for word, God desires all people to know the truth. So not only is God the truth, he wants everybody to know the truth. But on Calvinism, that's not true. God determines everybody to get important things wrong about theology. And Muslims believe the exact same thing. When you find yourself defending the Muslim, you got to ask yourself a question. Maybe I took a misstep along the way. Maybe I wasn't as careful as I could have been and should have been. But guess what? If that's the case, then you've got libertarian freedom. You could have reasoned otherwise. So
I'll jump in there and just say, just because Muslims believe in a deterministic view of Allah doesn't make determinism wrong. I know Tim would agree with that. Just because Muslims believe that, but the fact that Muslims do believe that, it should at least put a spark in your mind to go, why is my belief more similar to that of the Muslim faith than historically the Christian faith? And at least make you question it. And I was also corrected. I brought this up too, because we brought this up about Allah and the view of Muslims. And my brother actually works in the mission field in that area at times. He's back now, but and so he knows a little bit more about this. And I was corrected, and he was saying actually, and it wasn't from him, but from someone else that actually told me this. But actually, among Muslims, there's a debate too. There's free will Muslims. I don't know the Sunni Shiite debates. Yeah, there's a small group. And it looks throughout history, there has actually been debates even among Muslims over free will and determinism. And it's interesting if you look at the history of it, that the hard line determinists, the hardcore determinists, are typically the ones that fly planes into buildings and do all the Shiite stuff, because that deterministic worldview tends to attract that more vitriolic, angry types, versus the more free will view of those in the Muslim world. And the fact that he pointed that out was just demonstrating to me that there is a mindset among deterministic types that tends to attract a certain type of individual, a certain type of person, even in the Muslim tradition. And so I just thought that was interesting when an expert in the field kind of pointed that out to me, just because it, at least if nothing else, it makes you self-reflect and go, why am I attracted to this way of thinking? What is drawing me to believe this mechanistic way, this deterministic way of thinking about God and my relationships to him? Could there be something about me that I need to be better willing to self-reflect upon and think through why I've come to these conclusions? Anyway, that's a whole nother rabbit trail we can go down. But
let me just quickly add
on.
that the problem that I was comparing to Islam isn't so much that there's no free will and that God determines everything. Most Muslims say that that Allah determines everything. The big problem is that their view of Allah is he's untrustworthy. He could just as easily, he can make you think that you're a saved Muslim your whole life, and then there's nothing that would prevent him from changing his mind at the last second and damning you to hell for eternity, even if he kept all of his
in other words,
commands.
they come right out and say that. The determinist Muslims come right out and say that. And
yeah, no assurance.
Right.
No assurance of the best you have for assurance of salvation is to be martyred in jihad. Right. Okay. That's why Hamas doesn't care if they die. They say all the time that you Jews and Christians, you love life, but we love death. Why? Because they believe that if they die while attacking Jews and Christians or anybody else, that they go straight to heaven. That's their best shot at salvation. So anyway, I'm saying, look, they don't even, I mean, the problem with the law is can't be trusted. You don't have assurance of salvation. Now, back to the free will thing, David Wood is probably known as one of the most credible philosophers that he probably knows more about Islam than anybody else. And I've had many conversations with him. One of the things that he told me was that the vast majority of Islam rejects libertarian freedom and affirms divine determinism. He said, however, that the late and great Nabil Qureshi, who was a former Muslim, then became a Christian and then sadly died. He was one of the few when he was still a Muslim that believed that we had libertarian freedom. But I could be wrong on that. That conversation was years ago. But I guess let me get to the biggest point here that I'm trying to convey here. Our views of God cannot entail that he deceives those who are actively following him. In Scripture, we see that God allows those who have rejected him, rejected truth, to believe more lies, right? He's like, oh, you want to believe lies? Have it your way. Here's some more. But we nowhere in Scripture see somebody who is actively following Christ and then God determines him to get stupid or to reason incorrectly or to hold false theological beliefs. If that were the case, then we should doubt the Gospels. We should doubt Paul's letters, right? Because, well, the same deity that's inspiring these guys to write these scriptures is also the same deity that determines his followers to get things wrong. So if you're going to say that that's the kind of God that you serve, and even if you don't say it, but it's logically entailed by everything else you say, then we have reason to doubt Scripture, the very words that you're using and twisting to get to your deterministic conclusions. And that's a huge problem. So we cannot have a God that is a deity of deception. You cannot say that. I mean, look, Guillaume Bignon said it. No, God is determining my fellow Calvinists to get these important things wrong. You can't have
most
that.
Calvinists, I would think, would say I'm deceived by not believing Calvinism. And for them to also say God determined for me not to accept Calvinism means God is determined for me to be deceived. How do you not conclude, therefore, that God is the deity of deception? That's basically what you're saying. And how does Bignon reply to that? I'm curious.
I mean, I'd like to know, and I'd also like to know if you're willing to say that, the God I worship determines other Christians, other Calvinists to get theological beliefs wrong and metaphysical beliefs wrong, then how do you know he's not doing that to you right now? And please don't beg the question in response. Right?
You can't know. There's no way you can know. If God is determined for you to have a false theological belief and not to know it, there's no way for you to know it because he's God. How could God fail in determining one of his creatures to believe something that's not true? And they would never know. You have absolutely no rational basis on which to hold true anything that you are arguing for. I see no fault in that logical conclusion, and I've heard it stated in many different ways. I've heard William Lane Craig state the same basic argument in a just in that question answer thing, he's just giving off the top of his head. He's not making constructs like you are with the, all the points, but he's just making the same kind of basic arguments of, you have a vertigo that sets in about, the circular reasoning of a determinist and all these kinds of things that he mentions. And he's making basically the same argument that you're making that I've made. One argument I've made that I haven't put into a construct, probably a sound theological or construct for argumentation, but I've basically said the safest place you can be if you have a choice in the matter is to choose to reject determinism, because if determinism is true and God wants you to be a determinist, then he will determine you to be one. He will bring it to pass unchangeably. And so as long as you feel like you have the freedom to reject determinism, you certainly should, because that's the safest place you can be. It seems like, I don't know how you would put that into a construct, but it seems like that seems sound. It sounds like a sound argument to me.
Well, basically, based on the constructs and the syllogisms and deductive arguments that I've offered here, that makes sense. So for somebody, they can't just dismiss what you've said. Now I've seen you say that before, and I've seen people like, oh, Leighton's not being serious. Now you can say, look, based on these deductive arguments, what I'm saying here makes sense. So you don't get to just dismiss this. You have to deal with these arguments. And ultimately, if the determinist is wrong, it's because he wasn't careful. If I'm wrong, it's because I've been necessitated and determined to be wrong by someone else, something or someone else.
And so that's what it's exactly the way I've worded it is if either I'm right in defending the goodness and the glory of God, or God has determined for me to be wrong for the praise of his glory.
Yeah, for morally sufficient
either
reasons,
way.
that doesn't help.
I feel like I'm in a pretty safe place because either I'm wrong by his determination, and he is glorifying himself through deceiving me to believe that I'm right, or I'm actually rightly defending the glory of God. I mean, those are only two options. Right.
Yeah. I mean, look, we can't start with the idea that God is a deity of deception or affirm a view that even entails it, even if you're not aware of that entailment or implies it in any way, right? We need a God of truth who desires all people to come to a knowledge of truth. Just as 1 Timothy 2:4 says, not like we're just making stuff up, right? We need that God who does not occasionally, if not often, determine all people, including each and every one of his committed followers, to get important things wrong. That's what we need. We got to start with that God, a maximally great being, the God of truth described in the Bible. And if you start there, then we can start to make sense. In my debate with Alex Malpass, I said, look, if atheism is true, we want to expect to be the kinds of things that had the power to freely think, to infer best explanations, and to attain truth about metaphysical reality. But if Christianity is true, the God of truth, John 14:6, who also desires us to know the truth about metaphysical reality, 1 Timothy 2:4, would then give us power and create us in his image and likeness so that we would have the tools necessary and the power and the ability to infer best explanations about ultimate reality and to actually attain truth about ultimate reality. We could do it. If we should expect to be able to do that if Christianity is true. And so then it means that when we don't do it, when we fail to do that, it means you were not as careful as you should have been and could have been. But again, that entails libertarian freedom. You weren't as careful as you could have been, but you should have been, but you could have done otherwise. That's libertarian freedom. So it's just, heads I win, tails you lose, determinists.
Yes.
This is a strong position. Anyway, what do you think, Leighton?
Well, I want to take a little bit of time, and I want to deal with some of the side chat questions, comments, some super chats that came in. But before we do that, I've gathered here a couple of objections to your argument, and I wanted to get your responses to them. First, from our friend Chris Date, who's also a part of Trinity Seminary. Those interested in getting a higher theological education should consider Trinity Seminary. There's links in the show note that you can find out about Trinity as well. Chris Date's objections. One, I just don't have that intuition. He used that argument against me as well. That I can't relate to you, Leighton, when it comes to that point. In other words, I just don't have that intuition. And the other one, I heard. I listened to your discussion back and forth with him on this, and he said the resurrection of Jesus assures me that God is not deceiving me. Both of those I have immediate responses to when I hear them, but I wanted to hear your responses.
Yeah. Well, first of all, before pushing back against Chris again, let me take a note to just say that I love this guy, love him. He is a deep thinker, and
if Jonathan Pritchett were here, he'd say, "Oh, shut up with all the niceties and being all kind and just get after it. Get
Sorry,
it."
Pritchett. Sorry. No, Chris is a great thinker, and I think he's done so much, especially regarding how we should maybe think or rethink things about hell. And he has influenced me to do that. I just think his view of hell does make more sense if we have libertarian freedom. But with that said, okay, so he did. These were in my debate with Chris. He did say both of these things. He said, I don't have that intuition when I would offer things like the deity of deception argument and stuff. But that assumes that your intuitions are trustworthy. If a deity of deception determines your intuitions, then appealing to your intuitions don't get you out of hot water. It just makes the problem worse. So we have to.
Why does one Christian intuit this and another Christian intuit that?
Right.
I determined them. It doesn't really say anything to the problem.
I was just, at the last DPS a couple months ago, one of the speakers, I think it was Kenton Sparks, he noted that there's a difference between our intuitions and our kind of our passive intuitions and our active analysis or active rational deliberatings. And he said that these intuitions are the manner, kind of, I can't remember the exact words, kind of how we think, the way we reason through things passively. And I'm butchering this.
Well,
but
yeah,
our thought processes that aren't up to us.
The difference between deliberating versus what you just naturally intuit without even thinking about it,
Yeah, you don't. Yeah, it's
those
us
kinds
not
of things.
thinking about it. It's the manner of which
Right.
we know things. I think he said that we don't actively think about. Now, when we engage in active deliberation and an active analysis, then we're taking control of the wheel, right? We might have been on autopilot, and now we're like, okay, turn the autopilot off. I'm taking the wheel. I'm gonna start examining things myself. So
it's like I might intuit that the sun is revolving around the earth based upon what I've seen, but then I start studying, I start looking into the evidence, I realize no, actually the earth is revolving and rotating around the sun. I've learned this through study. I've deliberated over it, and so I've come to a different conclusion than I held to.
Yeah. So a defeater was raised against your intuition, and so you're justified in holding your intuitions. Unless a defeater is raised. And so what I am doing is I'm raising defeaters against Chris's intuitions. But then to respond, I don't have that intuition that God determines all these false beliefs or whatever. Or no, that's not what he's. As I was pointing out the deity of deception arguments, it's been over a year now that we had that debate. And his common response was, I don't have that intuition. Well, the problem is if a deity of deception determines your intuitions, you've just jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. Doesn't do anything to advance the discussion. Now, he did say, look, to that second point there, something about, since we have evidence of the resurrection of Jesus, we do have historical evidence of that, praise God. But the historical evidence of the resurrection of Jesus assures me that God is not a deity of deception or God is not deceiving me. Well, here's the deal. If Loki, the god of mischief, was going to really pull a fast one on humanity, would he raise somebody from the dead that is always telling the truth, or somebody who is also just as deceivious or deceptive as he is? So once you say that God, or even if your view entails that God is a deity of deception, appealing to the resurrection isn't going to cut it, because why should you trust the words of somebody who deceives all people, raises from the dead? All you're doing is saying, oh, that guy's got a lot of supernatural power. It doesn't mean he's a good person or a God of truth. As soon as your view entails that God is not the God of truth or a deity of deception who determines all of his followers to get things wrong, then who cares who he raises from the dead? But if God is the God of truth, the scripture makes clear, and desires all people to know the truth, the scripture makes clear, right? But even if you didn't have scripture, like if you just start with, if God is a maximally, let's start with the ontological argument, and we get to God as a maximally great being. Let's start with the moral argument. You don't even need scripture. And we see that God is this foundation of love. And that and obviously then a loving being would want us to know the truth. We could start reasoning that way. Well, if we have that kind of creator of the universe and he raises somebody from the dead, then all of a sudden, whoever that supernatural being is given his divine stamp of approval, we ought to listen to. We ought to listen to. And so it's only if God is a God of truth, who loves us all and desires all people to know the truth, that we can trust our intuitions at all, that we can trust our ability to actively analyze things and infer and attain truth about ultimate metaphysical, theological reality. And it's what provides us reason to trust the words of Jesus himself. We need a God of truth. We start with a God of truth.
Well, and both of those arguments I can make. And I could just say, well, I don't have the intuition of accepting determinism. And I also would say the resurrection of Jesus assures me that I have not been determined to believe falsely, which is exactly what Big Young says. God did determine me to believe falsely, apparently. Yeah. And so I could use both of those arguments and just restate them. And so they seem to be somewhat begging the question. But to be fair to Chris, go back and listen to his actual statements. It's only fair for you to listen to the debate and let him make these statements himself and listen to the full argument. I'm just summarizing the basic points here of his arguments against you, or his objections to the free thinking argument, so that, to give my guest obviously an opportunity to refute those.
Right. That was on the, I'll just say that debate with Chris Date was on the Faith Unaltered YouTube channel, if you want to find it.
Okay. Yeah. Search for Faith Unaltered and Tim Stratton, Chris Date's name on YouTube, and you can find those. And it's only fair for you to listen to the other side for themselves. And we don't obviously have time to play every single argument made by every person, but that's the fair way of doing it. Go ahead.
And really quickly, talking about these intuitions or maybe better direct awareness, or direct acquaintance with something. One thing that J.P. Moreland and I discussed in our paper was that we're aware. You can be internally aware of the difference between passive thoughts in which you have no control and active thoughts in which you can take control of. Now, if determinism is true, if God determines everything, the entirety of my mental activity, then all thoughts are passive. I have no active control over any of them, but I experience what JP called, I think, a different qualitative texture in these different kinds of thinkings. And so if I have direct access and direct acquaintance and direct awareness, that sometimes I can stop thinking about things passively and take control of the ship of reason, then I have direct awareness of my libertarian freedom. In a good way, I think almost, maybe I'm just a horrible person, but let's talk about, there's sometimes that passive thoughts go through my head that are just evil. Right? Simple. Anybody out there, any guy, raise your hand if you've ever had some lustful thought go through your head.
That's just you, Tim.
Just me.
It's only you. Yeah, it's just you.
Right. There's times when a passive thought that I'm not in control. I mean, we think about dreams. Maybe you wake up and you have a dream like, what the heck? Right. But this happens even in when I'm not dreaming and I'm awake, and a thought will go through my head. And I'm like, whoa. Now, at that point, I have options. I can grab onto it and say, let me think about that for a little bit. Or I can say, I can grab it and destroy it. take that thought captive and destroy it. And I actually practice that when I have passive thoughts run through my head that are evil. I do practice 2 Corinthians 10:5. I actually see myself. That's one way that I think slowly been overcoming sinful thoughts. Right? Still not perfect, got a long way to go. But if I have a sinful thought, active or passive, right? But if I'm aware of this passive evil thought, I will say, no, take that thought captive. Don't even arrest it, destroy it. And I imagine myself just destroying that. Anyway, it's maybe I'm weird. That's what I do.
No, what you're talking about. I mean, when I did youth ministry, this is exactly the kinds of illustrations that, and I know you've done youth work as well.
Yeah,
that's the kind of thing, the visual, you got to visualize yourself literally taking that thing, that thought, as if it's a prisoner, as if it's an actual being, and grabbing it and absolutely demolishing it, destroying it. And by visualizing yourself doing that, it gives you that mental control over that thing instead of it controlling you, as if I can't help this. This is just who I am. I have a temper, and that's just who I am, and it's just what I am. And that's the way some people handle temptation and problem. I just have these attractions. I just have this kind of, it's just who I am. It's just the way I was made. And what the Bible is saying, no. You have some control over it. You have self-control. You have the ability to control yourself. You're different than the animals. You don't act instinctively. Freedom. You can grab a hold of that thought. You can take it captive, and you can control it. It doesn't have to control you. You don't have to let it take your life over and control you.
Right.
That's the difference between us and animals. That is the heart of libertarian free will.
And look, this is where the rubber meets the road. And we're not just having these theological and philosophical conversations for the sake of academic exercise. We are saying, look, this is why it's practical. And this is how we can live and learn to live more in align with the law of Christ, as we can follow Christ, as we can take those evil thoughts captive and destroy them or let them consume us. You have the power. And like you said, Scripture is filled with self-control language. Either the thing that I refer to as the self is in control, or something or someone else is in control. One or the other. Law of excluded middle. Either I'm in control or something or someone else is. And Scripture is clear that we have self-control. And so Scripture is clear that we've got libertarian freedom, at least the libertarian freedom to think and take thoughts captive or not. And I'll tell you what, I've worked with students for so long. I started out my student ministries as a Calvinist, preaching exhaustive divine determinism. And I saw, and a lot of people that know my story know how one of my students became an atheist. I think a lot of it was because of what I was preaching about Calvinism. Well, as I went to try to start defeating his arguments, it led me to realize I needed to rethink a whole bunch of things. And now I am aware. It's just, I don't even need the arguments, but I've got the arguments. But I am aware of the qualitative difference, this different qualitative texture between a passive thought and then me taking control and being an active thinker, which is what I mean by libertarian freedom. So, but it helps students. I still work with students all the time. I lead these what we call Maven immersive experiences, at least 5 weeks a year. I'm with teenagers and equipping them how to think, how to take their thoughts captive, how to share the gospel, how to use apologetics to back it up, how to be a good theologian, and just how to make a difference in the world for God's glory.
That's awesome.
And that's stuff. It makes a difference.
It's not only to discern whether something is correct or incorrect, if interpretation is right or wrong, is not only the logical coherence of it, which we've talked about before, but also its practicality. How does it play itself out? What good are you doing to a student to tell him that his choices have been determined irresistibly by God? What is that? How is that helping him to mature in the faith? And even I think even some good Calvinists would say, no, you shouldn't tell young immature Christians that. Why not? Why would truth harm anybody? If truth harms somebody, it may not be true, and so you may rethink it. And this is why one of the reasons that I did that thing with Al Mohler in his whole study that he did, where he was talking about naturalistic determinists and talking about how they make free will and human responsibility illusory, an illusion. And he a Calvinist is saying this, and I'm trying to figure out how he's not seeing the connection between the arguments that he's making against these naturalistic determinists. But he cites this study that they do. These naturalistic determinists do a study and demonstrate that those who believe in determinism are more likely to steal and cheat and all these kinds of things than those who believe in a higher authority and an absolute law and truth. And so they conclude, though we believe determinism is true, naturalistic determinism is true, and there is no God, that's what they hold to. They believe it's not good for society. In other words, they believe it's true, but it's not good for society. So we shouldn't necessarily teach it in our schools. Yeah. That's their findings. And of course, Al Mohler just jumps all over this, trying to say, obviously, truth bears itself out as it works. It's practical. And he's making a great case, but I think inevitably he's also making a great case for libertarian free will and not for theistic determinism. Or naturalistic determinism. I think he's defeating both of those for the same reasons.
Yeah, ultimately. I agree. And I've seen those same studies that show that if you believe that determinism is true, you are more apt to be an unsavory character. You're more apt to cheat, for example. And in fact, I know a Calvinist who believes that God determines everything. And, he ultimately cheated on his wife and divorced his family. But he, ultimately, I think it helps him to sleep at night because he's like, well, look what God made me do. He becomes the victim, not the victimizer on that.
Yeah. And the thing is my wife is in counseling and things. And so we've had discussions about this, but even on a lower layman level, even from unbelievers and, non-Christian believers, theists maybe, but just more like even Catholics or Mormons and people who believe in a God. But some of them will come and see her, and she'll notice that oftentimes they have this underlying, well, God made me like this kind of a feel, or well, this is just the way I was made. This is just who I am. I guess this is God's plan for my life. And a lot of times counselors are trying to kind of tear away this bad theology because they're blaming God for decisions they made. And they're saying, no, God doesn't want that for you. That's not what God picked for you. And having to kind of peel off some bad ways of thinking about creation and God in order to get to the root of their problem. And the root of the problem is oftentimes realizing for themselves, my decisions and the way I'm thinking is what's leading to this bad behavior and these bad consequences. And getting people to that point is really the job of a counselor, is to kind of getting people to realize that for themselves, that it's this way of thinking, the cycle of my injuries that I've caused on myself because of the way I'm thinking. I think I get into this cycle. Anyway, we can go down that road. Let me jump into this last couple of objections. Bing Young, who we played earlier, was the guy who said, yes, Leighton has been determined. Tim was determined to be a Calvinist for a while, but God determined for them to leave Calvinism and to speak out against it for whatever reason. But God has a morally sufficient reasons to do this. In other words, he's willing to say, yes, God does obviously make Leighton be deceived into believing Calvinism is untrue, but he has morally sufficient reasons for doing so. How do you respond to that?
It doesn't escape the problem. What Guillaume is doing here is trying to save God's character, but that does nothing to put us in a better epistemic position to know truth about reality. So if a deity of deception determines all of his followers to get important things about theology wrong, but he does it for morally sufficient reasons, all of his followers still get things about ultimate reality wrong. So it doesn't avoid the objection that I'm raising here. So I'll grant, well, sure, maybe your God does, or maybe a deity of deception has great reasons to be a deity of deception. Well, he's still a deity of deception, and therefore everything he's making me think is untrustworthy. So yeah, it doesn't solve the problem.
Okay, objection that I'm seeing some on the side chat, and I'm anticipating because I hear it all the time. If you're saying that Bing Yang believes that God deceives and deceives and is a deity of deception, you must believe that Bing Yang's not a Christian, that he's not saved.
Oh,
Why not? Why would you say that he's believing in a deception, but he's still saved?
Because I don't think that he is being careful. That doesn't mean that perhaps he has an emotional attachment to Calvinism for some reason. Perhaps, I mean, I think he really thinks it's true. Okay. But I don't think he's reasoned correctly, right? This is what the whole free thinking argument's about.
And God's grace is big enough to cover our philosophical misconceptions about God.
Yes. Yeah. I just,
praise God for that.
Look, I have argued on my YouTube channel that, look, when somebody understands, I say there's 6 key essential ingredients of the gospel. Maybe more, but there's 6 that I highlight here. And the divine determinist and the Christian who's not a divine determinist mean different things when we use the same words. So we can use, it's like talking to a Mormon. The Mormon is going to use the same words when they share the gospel, but it means something radically different than what we mean. So I take, and I spend several weeks a year in Utah doing evangelism and apologetics with Mormons. And so it's been interesting for me to see some similarities here. But the Calvinist, when they share the gospel, will use the exact same words that I do and use the exact same words that the Mormon uses. So you got to say, what do you mean by all of these things? And when you unpack it, this is how I show that Mormons have a different view of a gospel. I'm like, this is what you mean. This is what I mean. We both can't be right. So I've done the same thing with Calvinists and determinists. I'll say, okay, well, look, you say the same things as I, you're using the same words, but this is what you mean. This is what I mean. With that said, one of us is wrong. And I'll say, look, with that said, Calvinist, I think we're both saved. I sure think I'm saved, and I think Guillaume Bignon is saved, and my other Calvinist friends are saved. Brothers in Christ, does that raise an issue? It does. I'm going to bracket that right now and just say I am currently co-authoring a paper, an academic paper on this topic. So I'm not going to get into that topic yet, but I'm just going to focus on the Calvinists here. I have made it clear on my YouTube video that Calvinists are saved, and I appeal to R.C. Sproul, the Calvinist, when he was asked, hey, are all these Arminians or these Libertarians, are these non-Calvinist Christians, are they still saved? And he goes, well, of course they're still saved. Barely. He says barely.
Barely.
But due to a felicitous inconsistency. Now, I don't even go as far to say barely. I'll say, yeah, Calvinists are saved due to a felicitous inconsistency. What does that mean? Because they're confused and they haven't connected all the dots, right? They're letting their emotions get in the way. God's working on them. My point is they're not being as careful as they should be or could be. But that, again, entails libertarian freedom. So I am not saying that Guillaume Bignon is not saved, or that Calvinists aren't saved. I'm saying they're confused.
There could be somebody who's lost.
Hold on. They think that I'm confused.
Of course.
Are they saying that I'm not saved? So yeah, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, and I was just going to say that there can be somebody who affirms Calvinism who's actually lost, because we don't know their heart. Because we're not saying just because somebody affirms Calvinism that they're necessarily, we know for sure their heart condition. Just like there can be a provisionist who is a heart condition that we don't know about that's actually lost. And so that's not what he's saying. Is just because someone affirms Calvinism or aspects of Calvinistic theology does not necessarily mean they have not been redeemed. And that's what we're trying to get to.
I know a guy who claims to be a Molinist. I mean, I'm a Molinist. I know a guy who claims to be a Molinist. I see zero fruit in his life. Zero. So, I mean, look, you can be, I'm not saying he's not saved, but I don't see fruit in his life.
You can't tell.
I can't tell. And so, you can be a Molinist and not be saved. You can be an Arminian and not be saved. You can be a Calvinist and not be saved. You can call yourself a Christian and not be saved. You can call yourself that. It'd be a so-called Christian, but anyway, I'm talking too much. Well,
and Michael's saying if we need perfect doctrine to be saved, we're all in big trouble, and that's exactly right. We all have some problems. All right, the final objection I wanted to pull in here is Dr. White, Dr. James White. you need to apologize for making this argument. You're flattening it out, and you need to apologize. How do you reply
flattening
to?
out even mean?
You don't know? I thought you knew. I thought you.
Well,
figured.
no, jeez.
It's multi-orbed diamond. It's multi-orbed diamond shaped.
Right.
Yeah, and if you knew what that meant, then you would understand.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes, very common words used in the academic literature that we all know what that means. But no, so this comes from. So as I said earlier, in my debate with James White, I gave multiple arguments in my opening speech, and James White refused to deal with all of them. He ignored them. I had one argument. It was a syllogism, 2 steps into a deductive conclusion that ended, therefore Molinism is biblical. And that was the topic of debate. Is Molinism biblical? Excuse me. And he ignored that one. And then I gave the first iterations of the deity of deception argument, showing that James White doesn't have this, he can't have knowledge of this of his theological beliefs because on his view, it means that God is an omnipotent fiend or a deity of deception. He did not engage with that argument during the debate. So look, I'm the one that had the burden of proof, and that's why I went first, and I gave all these arguments. His job is to poke holes in my arguments. He didn't do it. So it's impossible to win a debate if you're the second speaker and you don't interact with the deductive conclusions that deductively conclude the topic of the debate, even if he's good with rhetoric and I was nervous. But with all that said, people were pointing out to him afterwards that you ignored Tim Stratton's arguments, Dr. White. You ignored him. And so he went back and he looked at this early version of the deity of deception argument, and he made a video. And his response was not to show why it fails. His response was to look into the camera and said, Tim Stratton, you need to apologize for making that argument. What do you do? I mean, the rational conversation is over at that point. It's not about, why should I apologize? I am why apologize for a logically sound, valid argument that reaches deductive conclusions?
You need to apologize for what God determined you to do.
Well, that too. And
if God determines you to apologize for what he determined you to do, you will. But if God determined for you not to apologize for what God determined you to believe, then you won't.
Right.
So
right. Yeah.
Keep that all in mind.
Yeah. Apparently, in his view, God is not determining me to apologize. And in fact, he's determining me to make this argument even stronger. And, and I would say I am freely choosing not to apologize, because that's a bad objection. I have freely chosen to partner with JP Moreland to make the argument even stronger. So not only did I not apologize for the argument, I decided to make the argument even stronger and to partner with one of the world's leading philosophers to fine tune it and to show exactly why it's a good argument.
Yeah. And I want to go through some of the super chat here to make sure people are recognized that did super chats and had questions. Yeah. One Corey here is saying he embraces Molinism, but strongly disagrees with provisionism equally to Calvinism. And so I thought that was an interesting thing. I'm not sure how, if someone affirms libertarian freedom under Molinism, who's a Christian, would disagree.
Hold on. He says monism. Does he mean Molinism? Because monism is a different philosophical category.
I just read Molinism.
He says Corey dumb Molinist. So I think it's a typo. So let's assume that he's saying I embrace Molinism, but strongly disagree with provisionism equally to Calvinism. It's possible to do that, because if you're a Molinist, you can just be an Arminian. I know that,
and you disagree with some of the aspects of provisionism that are distinct from Arminians. Yeah,
right.
Okay,
right.
Maybe that's what he's talking about. Yeah,
it's a logically consistent position.
Okay, floral from under the rock is serious question. Allah is a deceiver, so it seems the God of Calvinism, Islam, is consistent. Would you say Calvinists possibly worship a false god similar to Islam? Obviously, there are differences. I think we kind of already addressed that with regard to whether Calvinists can still remain Christian. even though their Calvinism is not a biblical doctrine in specific. They can hold to beliefs that we would hold in common that are Christian, which would qualify them as Christians, even though they hold to a different view of philosophically of God. Do you want to talk any more about that? I think we've kind of already addressed that.
Well, yeah, I think it might be, the question could have been worded better. Allah is a deceiver. True. So it seems that the God of Calvinism and Islam is consistent. I think they meant inconsistent. I would say it's inconsistent. And then so would you say Calvinist?
Well, I think they're saying Calvinism and Islam are consistent with each other.
Oh, got it.
Regarding their view of God.
Yeah.
And so
then it says, would you say Calvinists possibly worship a false god similar to Islam? Obviously. So look, I'd say the problem occurs because the vast majority of Calvinists you talk to at church, the vast majority of Calvinists who are pastors, you'll hear them say when they say Calvinism is true, or even that compatibilism is true. I just talked to a pastor the other day. He said, well, I'm a compatibilist. I said, what do you mean by compatibilist? He goes, that God is sovereign over everything and we have free choices. And I said, when you said free choices, do you mean that I could choose otherwise, like it describes in 1 Corinthians 10:13? And I described that. And he goes, yeah, we have the power we have libertarian freedom. And I said, so what you're saying is that God is sovereign, but in a way that doesn't violate our libertarian freedom. He goes, yeah, I'm a compatibilist. And I said, okay, look, that's not what it means in the literature. What you were saying is you're a Molinist. And the Molinist says God's sovereignty is compatible with libertarian free will. I'm saying that's what's compatible. But in the literature that pastors don't read, most of them, let alone the people in the pews, that's not what compatibilism is. So I had a point there. Oh, are they? Anyway, well, I don't know if
I think we've covered I think we've covered that topic pretty good. So Solitary Emmy, thank you for your super chat regarding Tim sin. Lately, I've been seeing videos pop up about repentance is not repenting of sin but turning toward Jesus. What do you think of that?
Well, not turning toward Jesus is the ultimate sin. So
yeah, I think maybe what he's getting to is that it's not just saying I'm sorry for doing something wrong. Anybody can do that. Even an unbeliever pagan can say, I really need to stop drinking, or I really need to stop beating my wife, or I really need to stop cheating on my taxes. Anybody can stop doing a bad thing. Repentance biblically is turning from that bad thing to someone else, which means you're turning to Christ for forgiveness. You're turning to him. You're turning away from your sin. And so true biblical repentance is turning from your sin to the person of Jesus Christ. Whereas, repenting cannot be just thought of as stopping sin. And maybe that's what he's getting at.
I like that. I mean, it's being a Christian is being a Christ follower. So if I'm treating people in a way that Jesus would not, in a manner in which violates the law of Christ, then I am not following Christ in that sense. And so when people hold each other accountable, when good Christians, brothers and sisters, hold their other brother and sister accountable, they're saying, look, you're acting in this way, but the law of Christ says this, Jesus says this. You need to turn, you need to repent and actually follow Christ like you say you do. I'll never forget being in college. And I was working at a factory, working my way through college. So working there part-time, and I was kind of living a double life back then. I believed Christianity was true. I went to church every Sunday, but man, I'd be partying with my friends on Friday and Saturday night. And just depending on who I was around, if I was around my church friends, I looked like this great Christian. When I was around my non-Christian friends, you couldn't tell a difference. And I was working at this factory, and I was working in the corner, making these big light bulbs that go on these big maxi lights that would light up construction sites, right? That's what I was working on. And the guy who was working in that corner with me owned a Christian music store on the side. So he was always playing DC Talk and Audio Adrenaline and Newsboys and Petra and all these, Striper, all these Christian bands. And so I'm constantly hearing the message of this, this Christian message. And then I'll never forget him saying, Tim, you claim to be a Christian, but your life doesn't know, the way you live your life is clear that you're not always following Christ. And then he said, I've got some tickets to this DC Talk concert. Would you like to go? I'm like, yeah, I'd love to go to a concert. And they played a song called Jesus Freak. And it was, and it hit me so hard, because what will people think when they hear that I'm a Jesus freak? What will people do when they find out it's true? I don't really care if they label me a Jesus freak. There ain't no denying the truth. And I realized I need to follow Christ. I need to at least strive to follow Christ every day. And this brother was holding me accountable. He's saying, Tim, just the way God orchestrated all that, to have this guy freely choose to keep me accountable. And to say, Tim, you're not living consistently with what you say you believe. The way you treat others doesn't show that you're following Christ there. And he was making it clear that nobody's perfect, but he sees this pattern. And he said, you need to change. And he said, you live your life one way on the weekend, but that's not what Jesus would be doing. You need to change. And then hearing that song, my life was changed that night at that concert, and that's why I'm in ministry today. So thank you, DC Talk and Jesus Freak. But anyway, all that to say, follow Christ, repent and follow Christ. Be a Jesus freak.
Yeah, a good testimony. I like to hear that. Juan, thank you for your super chat. I just want to say thank you to you both, because you have given me different ways to defend my faith against many who have tried to undermine it in the last few years. Thank you, Juan, for that super chat and for those kind words as well.
Thank you.
Puritan fan. This is an example. I'm going to quote from Harris Arms, who's Chris Harris, and Puritan fan, both of which are Calvinist. And this is an example of what's called question begging. The question begging fallacy is when you assume true the very point up for debate. And so when you assume something's true that's up for debate, you're begging the question. Just so you understand that. Here's an example of that. Puritan fan says, this is exactly the objector of Romans 9, who has resisted his will. And then Chris Harris says, exactly, I've been saying that for years. And so what are they doing here? They're doing exactly what Nathan points out. You have to beg the question that Paul is dealing with the objector to determinism to conclude that. In other words, you have to assume that Paul is answering a determinist versus answering someone who is an Israelite who has grown calloused in his rebellion over years due to his libertarianly free choices, mind you. And now God is cutting him off in his rebellion to ensure the engrafting of the Gentiles, which is what our interpretation is. So those are the two interpretations side by side. He's either objecting to a determinist, and Paul is answering a determinist he's objecting to those who object to determinism. He's objecting to a libertarian free thinker like Tim. And Paul is defending his determinism in Romans 9. Now, if that's true, they're right, but you can't assume that's true. You can't assume that Paul is answering a libertarian free advocate, okay, and defending determinism. You have to establish that from the text. And we went over that when we had Braxton on, all three of us, we went over all of those things, but I wanted to give you a chance to reply to that too.
Well, I'll just quickly add, I've got a couple of articles on my website about Romans 9. One, I think it's called Who Are You, Oh Man? And I show that Romans 9 implies libertarian freedom. And we can show that by the absurdity of the contrary. So I've got my beanie here. It's cold outside. So I'm going to make a little puppet. Yeah. So what happens when this happens? Hey guys, why have you made me like this? How dare you? Who are you? Oh, puppet, to talk back to me. Well, you're making me do that. Stop it. Hey, so really,
the only reason you would question, only reason you would talk back to God is if God determined you to talk back to him. That's exactly.
And that's absurd. Who are you, oh man, to talk back to me, even though I'm making you talk back to me? That's absurd. So I say, look, what that means then, since that's absurd, is it implies that yes, God is sovereign over this whole thing, but you still have some freedom. You did not have to talk back to God. You could have done otherwise, and that's why you're guilty. But yeah, I point people to my articles on Romans 9 on my website.
Well, and Chris replies and saying, I'll say it again, who the interlocutor is irrelevant. He says there are still people who are sinning that are doing the will of God, and God still judges them for what they will do. Well, what I would say to that is, go ahead, you respond.
I was just going to say that's true on Molinism, so that gets you nowhere.
Right, and I would just say, well, they're not doing the will of God because they're sinning. God knows their sin and uses their sin to accomplish His will, but their sinning is not His will. I mean, that's the easiest way.
It's not determined by Him.
Exactly.
Now, to bring up the Avengers and the Doctor Strange analogy that James White hates when I do, and many others do too. Put that back up if you would for me.
I already started. I got rid of it. Sorry.
Look, we can say like Doctor Strange looked at the end game. He had knowledge of 14,605 different possible worlds, possible futures, that he had the power to actualize each one of them. He picked one of them with the eternal or with the end game in mind. Now, he also knew everything that was going to happen in there, things that he doesn't determine, even including gratuitous evils, gratuitous sufferings, right? Including lots of death, including his own death. And so he knew all of that was going to happen if he actualized that world. Based on the end game, he said, this is the best feasible possible world. So he allows all that other stuff to occur. He did not have all the evil to occur that led to the best end game. So he's still sovereign over what he allows because he didn't have to create this world in the first place. So you don't get to just, this, in a very real sense, like I said, that, and the Doctor Strange analogy gives the Molinist analogy. And I would even say some open theists have something similar that they could appeal to. They don't have a 100% certainty like God would have on the Molinist view, but I think depends on the open theist you talk to. I think they can get close, at least better than a deterministic view. And you still get sovereignty. So over everything that happens, everything that he allows, but God doesn't just merely permit or allow evil. On the Calvinistic deterministic view, God makes it happen. God uses his power. It's God provides the antecedent conditions sufficient to necessitate the child getting abused or the person getting mutilated. Necessitated every instance, every specific detail of evil that happened on October 7th. Is that it? When Hamas attacked Israel? God made it happen down to the detail. And I don't know if people are aware, but that's some of the worst evil that's ever happened on the planet.
And that's why we talk about how we're defending not just this philosophical concept of libertarian freedom. Our primary goal is to defend what we believe is God's good character. Yeah. And by denying the autonomous evil choices of man. And when I say autonomous, I don't mean that we exist autonomously from God's will, or that we are, are completely autonomous in every sense of the word. What I mean is that our choice to do evil, our will to do evil, is autonomous from a holy God. And when Calvinists are defending the holiness of God, they'll use the word separate all the time. But when they come to defend their concept of sovereignty or determinism, they berate people for using the word separate. And that I don't think you can have your cake and eat it too there. If you say God is separate when you're talking about his holiness, then what's he separate from, if not their evil moral intentions? And so that's a portion of that. Another super chat. Thank you for that, Solidarity Emmy. Do you think that sometimes before James White sins, he'll say, oh, well, I guess God determined this, I guess, to get drunk on a bottle of wine. Woohoo, yay. I doubt it. When I was a determinist or a Calvinist, I don't remember ever thinking that way. There was maybe a cognitive dissonance. I did, and at least for me, I did have times in which I would justify my behaviors that I did that were wrong by saying, I guess God's keeping me in this weak state, or he's humbling me by giving me these bad desires, whatever they may be. And so, yeah, there was times where my deterministic thinking led me down a bad path, but I don't remember ever cognizantly, deliberating and thinking, oh, I guess God is going to determine whatever I do anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and go get drunk and, whatever. I don't remember ever thinking that way. I don't know about you, Tim, if you thought that way or not.
I mean, I sincerely believed and preached that God determines everything. And I remember saying things like, when you stub your toe, God determined that to happen. When you drop your pencil, God determined that to happen. When you sin, God determined that to happen. And so, I mean, I was trying to be consistent. I don't know if I would. I think there were some times when I could think about, in the midst of a sin, thinking, God, why are you making me do this? I do remember one time praying and saying, God, would you please determine me and make me? I said, I am your puppet. Please determine me to live according to your will, or to not sin. You know, I was begging.
I think I do remember, Lord, if you need, as if you need my permission, I give it to you to make me into whatever vessel you want me to do, or, you know, these kinds of things, you know, as if we're not really responsible for cleansing ourselves, as the scripture actually says.
I was probably in my early 20s when I prayed that prayer, if I remember right. So.
Yeah. Just thank you for super chat. It says, Dr. Tim, do you believe we are able to respond to the gospel? I'm assuming LF means Leighton Flowers, not Libertarian free will. Do you believe we are able to respond to the gospel like Leighton believes? What is your take on the T of tulip? I know you emphasize the ability to reject God. Is that the same as the ability to respond?
So I offer, instead of tulip, I offer, this isn't political by any means, I offer Trump. So I think about playing poker. It's not a political endorsement. I'll tell you what, when I first started offering this, and I was joking around even and saying, hey, you know, Donald Trump, blah, blah. I mean, that's the first time I ever saw people get triggered. And I realized, ooh, there's something different.
The name Trump, the name Trump will trigger people. Yes. No matter where you stand theologically.
This was before, this was like in 2014 or 2015 when I first threw out this Trump acronym. And so what I offer as a Molinist is the T stands for total depravity. But I am going to define total depravity different than Calvinists do, probably. But I say there's not one. In fact, here, people want to read it in the study guide to Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. I have a going deeper section in here. Let me see if I can find it really quick so I can read it and not mess up. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay, so I say T of Trump, total depravity. And I say there is not one aspect of human existence which is not infected by sin. However, the image of God in which humanity is created has not been erased, but rather effaced. Think of a little drop of black ink being dropped into a tall glass of pure water. Every single particle of the water is now infected by the droplet of ink. However, it is still a glass of water. In fact, it's still potable, although your teeth will turn black. Just as the water needs to be cleansed and purified, every aspect of human existence needs to be cleansed and purified as well. So that's my view on total depravity. I don't think I get into it as deeply as you do, but I think you could affirm that. Yeah, no,
I would agree with any of that. Matter of fact, in my presentation on tulip, where I redefined all the letters to match provisionism, and I still use tulip, keep it as tulip, and I say I still believe in depravity. I don't believe in inability. And so I don't believe that because you're depraved, you're unable to respond positively to the message calling you to repentance and faith. Mm-hmm. And so just because we're depraved, we're fallen, doesn't mean we can't respond to God's message sent to fallen people, calling them to reconciliation from their fall. And so I'll affirm aspects of what Calvinists talk about with regard to depravity. And I often point out that most of the proof texts that they use to prove total depravity actually prove the thing we hold in common, which is that all men are sinful, that sin affects every part of us, all of those things that we all hold in common. The one point that I would differ with the Calvinist on is that because of that nature from birth, we therefore can't respond positively even to an inspired message sent by the Holy Spirit himself through inspired messengers, calling us to repentance, calling us to reconciliation from that fallen condition. And that sounds like that would be very much in line with what you said.
Right. Now, when you argue with Arminians, it's been a while. I hosted a conversation with you and some Arminians at one point. But your big disagreement there as a provisionalist is you say you don't need the prevenient grace, and the Arminians, strict Arminians, would say, no, you have to have prevenient grace. Is that right?
Well, it depends on the definition of prevenient grace. So like it always goes back to definition. Obviously you can't believe unless you know. I mean, there has to be revelation. So if that's considered prevenient grace, then yes, you need revelation. You need light to believe. How will they believe in one whom they've not heard? You have to hear in order to believe. And so there needs to be prevenient, previously workings of divine revelation and grace. What I'm saying is that I don't think that the fall ontologically changed human nature to make us incapable of believing inspired revelation and truth. So I don't think that there needs to be what Olson, who is a classical Arminian, he believes in a partial regeneration. In other words, there has to be an ontological change of your nature. This prevenient grace is a change of your very nature, causing you to have free will again. I think that's baggage. I don't think we've lost our free will because of the fall. I don't think that Genesis event talks about, hey, you got labor pains. You got the toiling of the soil. And also, by the way, ontologically, your nature has been changed that you can't respond positively to me anymore unless I step in and supernaturally grace you, giving you back that free will again. Yeah. I think that's all philosophical baggage added.
I need to think more about these things. This is your lane and not my lane when you start getting into that stuff. But it just seems, I can't even think, is it Matthew? I might have my gospels wrong. But where the disciples are asking Jesus why he's always talking about things in parables. And he says, well,
Mark
it's because
4. Yeah, Mark 4 and Matthew 13, okay. And Matthew 13 as well. Yeah.
Okay. And Jesus basically like saying, well, if I make it more clear, then these folks who, it's like, okay, we need them to crucify me, so we can't get them saved, at least not yet. So if I'm more clear, then they'll become Christians right now. They'll become Christ followers right now. Obviously, I'm summarizing and not quoting directly, but it seems to me if that's the case, then these these Pharisees and the Romans, they had what it takes to hear a clear gospel message.
That's my bread and butter, Tim, right there. Matter of fact, that's one of the major points that won me out of Calvinism was the fact that he used the fact that he's using parables to keep the Pharisees in the dark of his identity, to keep them from turning so as to be healed, it even says, is proof that had he not used parables, they had the natural ability to turn and be healed. So he's using parabolic language to keep already calloused and self-righteous individuals in their rebellion so as to accomplish redemption through them. As 1 Corinthians 2, 6 and 7 says, these things were hidden from the rulers of this age. Had they not been, they never would have crucified the Lord of glory, which is oftentimes is used as a Molinistic proof text. Had he not hidden these things from them using parabolic language, riddles, symbolism, difficult to understand language like eat my flesh and drink my blood, and he doesn't explain it to them. If he hadn't done that, then many more people could have and would have probably come to faith earlier versus later at Pentecost, when many of them do. Those same people who cry out, crucify him, many of them come to faith later. Christ is preventing that from happening temporarily by using parabolic language, which proves total inability isn't true. Right.
So, all right, now I'm interviewing you on your own show. I have one more question. Is there a way, because this is fascinating to me, is there a way to avoid that whole thing for the Arminians who disagree with you and just say, well, okay, look, let's suppose that we do need a prevenient grace. Well, God gives that to everybody as soon, when they're babies, so that when they do hear the gospel, they have what it takes.
Well, the Wesleyan Arminians tend to fall in that category where he argues that the cross itself, since the cross, from that point forward, everyone had this prevenient grace where people are now naturally able to respond because of what Christ accomplished on Calvary. Again, I don't really see a theological reason for that position necessarily, but that's basically what Wesleyan...
But the passages that we just referenced in Mark and Matthew are obviously chronologically prior to the cross. And so if Jesus is I don't think it's the cross itself that makes that possible, but
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah. I'm just saying there are different kinds of Arminians. In fact, the Brian Abishanos of the Society of Evangelical Arminians actually take issue with Roger Olson's view of partial regeneration, and they don't believe that men are dead in the Calvinistic way of dead. They would agree with us that dead is more of a metaphor or an idiom for separated due to rebellion, not incapable of responding. And so the Arminian is basically, because remember, Arminius was a Calvinist. I mean, he grew up in Geneva under Calvin's teaching. So he's pretty much adopted this concept of inability. Dead means dead in the corpse-like inability sense. And so you need something to fix that. Well, what better to fix that than partial regeneration? God makes you partially alive to give you back the ability that you lost in the fall. And that's prevenient grace on the classical Arminian view. Well, even some modern Arminians have modified that because they see the fault of that interpretation, and for good reason. And so that's where some of the debate has been. It's slicing it pretty thin, I realize. But basically, the Arminian has to say, well, God ordained, for whatever reason, for everybody to lose an ability, only to give everybody that ability back at some later point. Right. So, I mean, either way, you're still getting back to provisionism, which is everybody has this ability. And so that's why it's a nuance that doesn't really have to divide us, in my opinion.
Yeah, that seems right to me. I'll just really quickly give you that. It's total depravity, resistible, amazing grace, unlimited and unconditional love, middle knowledge of the elect, and perseverance of free saints. So if people want to read more about that, get the study guide to the Mere Molinism book.
Yeah, good word on that. Let me jump through some of these other super chats, make sure I hit them. Donald, thank you for your super chat. I don't know if I'm stretching things, but when I take into consideration EDD, I see it as a kind of blasphemous toward a holy God. Do you consider it, I guess, Tim, blasphemous towards a holy God?
Okay, I think that exhaustive divine determinism, right, entails whether, and I don't think most Calvinists realize this, but it entails that God is a deity of deception. As R.C. Sproul said, that's a felicitous inconsistency. They're not being careful. I think red flags are raised when somebody understands all of this and says, yes, I worship a deity of deception who determines everybody, including me, to get things wrong. You know, and they said that is the God Jesus revealed. You know, that's where I think things get scary, and I say I'm not the judge. But look, even with Guillaume, I don't think he's really making all that connection when he's saying, yeah, God's, and it's because he says, well, God's got morally sufficient reasons. But like I said, here, that doesn't solve the problem. So to say, yeah, we worship a divine deceiver, not really any, it's like saying that Loki, the god of mischief, created the universe and is a trinity, and raised another deity of deception from the dead. It's just, look, that feels bad coming out of my mouth when I'm describing another view. So I think that's a very dangerous position. Now, the vast majority of Calvinists don't realize what's entailed by that view. That's why I say they're still saved. They're my brothers in Christ. And again, before people get mad at me, say, look, you might be a Calvinist. You see me that way, unless you're willing to say I'm not saved. But if you see me as saved, you're saying that I'm the one who's confused. I'm just pointing out one side of this debate, at least, is wrong. One of us is confused, and we're trying to figure out who it is. And we need the other to have respectful, loving conversations where we're not attacking people's character or their intellect or their scholarship or their sentence structure or their redundancy or anything else like that. Let's talk about the arguments here, and let's work with each other to help everybody, including me and you, get closer to truth. That's what I want.
Yeah. Well said. DW, thank you for your super chat. Don't you love the fact that God loves you enough to grant your brain the ability to make a libertarian choice between true and false? Not a question there, but just a statement. And And that's the thing. If God has decreed for us to have libertarian freedom, then this is God's plan. So it's not like we're arguing that we're trying to fight against God's plan, as we're accused to at times. No, if libertarian free will is true, it's because God designed us that way. And so we're not trying to say we went out to a tool shed and built ourselves a free will. No, God designed us with this ability, and therefore he gets all the credit for it. And
it's a supernatural power that he's given us, which makes it possible to attain this metaphysical and theological truths. And J.P. Moreland and I talk about this a lot.
It's not like we're saying we're on par with God. It's
No,
saying
we're like
that we're more like God than the animals.
Uh-huh.
So it's not like we're on par with God. We're the same as God, but we're more like him than the animals are. And I don't see how on determinism we're any real different than the animals, except that we're being held accountable for what he instinctively causes us to do. And that's one of the problems I have with it.
And I would just say, with he noted about the human brain being able to do that, and I get what he's saying, but I would say, well, it's not the brain that does it; it's the fact that I'm a soul in the image of God, and I'm an immaterial thinking thing, not determined by the laws and events of nature, and that is that supernatural power. To not be determined by the laws and events of nature seems to be supernatural. That means I am something other than nature if I'm not determined by the laws and events of nature. And so I've got this power because I'm in the image and likeness of God, as Genesis 1:26 makes clear. And that gives me the power to be a free thinker, to attain truth about metaphysical reality.
Yeah.
And if you want to learn more about the soul, talk to Eric Hernandez, talk to J.P. Moreland, talk to Joshua Ryan Ferris. All these guys are doing awesome work on the soul.
There's Faithiest Atheist.
Richard.
He's going to be at Richard. He's going to be at our conference for the evangelism conference. You can go to San Antonio on January 21st this month, January 21st and 22nd. We're going to have a conference there. You can find out more online if you go to Texas Baptist, the evangelism page there. That's, by the way, I'm not a one-string banjo. See, I've got other things on my docket, things that I do that I don't talk about here very often, but because Richard jumped on and I know he's going to be there helping us out, I thought I would mention it. And yes, Richard is not a believer, but
my favorite atheist.
He's an awesome guy, and we're still working on him and praying for him. And I'm. I hope he does, because I love the brother, and he's a hard worker and he's a good man.
And he knows how we feel about him. So he knows when we say things like, he'll come around. So he knows we mean that.
He knows what we mean by that. He doesn't take that disrespectively or like we're condescending him. He has really good discussions with us, and he makes us think deeper about things too. So that's always a good thing. He says, is it possible that our brains deceive us sometimes because that helps us move or not move in ways that tend to help us survive and thrive?
Yeah. No, I think it is possible. I think that's totally conceivable. Alvin Plantinga's, I think, discussed a lot of these in his writings. But my argument is not that our brains never deceive us. And in fact, sometimes, I mean, I think, atheists believe that Mormonism is false. I believe that Mormonism is false, but say that it was all about surviving and thriving and propagating your DNA. It seems like Mormonism would be one of the best beliefs to have, because, hey, you can have 50 wives and have 10 kids with each wife, I mean, talk about propagating your DNA. But no, I mean, just back to Richard's question here. I do think it's possible that our brains deceive us, sometimes at least, because that helps us move or not move in ways that tend to help us survive and thrive. I also think that I think that through evolution, if that were true, that it could also give us a bunch of true beliefs about how to survive and thrive. That's why I'm not focused on crossing the street or tiger avoidance behavior, which in my earlier days, I would have gone after those too. There's still folks who do go after those. I've decided with JP's guidance to back off a little bit and not be so aggressive. And we're just going to focus on metaphysical beliefs. And so when we start asking about things. Hey, does God exist or does he not exist? That's a metaphysical belief. Do we have free will or not have free will? That's a metaphysical belief. Do abstract objects really exist? That's a metaphysical matter. So there's all kinds of metaphysical issues that, which would include all theological issues too, that I'm laser focused on at this point. And I think the free thinking argument and deity of deception arguments show that we'll bracket the stuff that might help us survive in the world. We're talking about metaphysical beliefs. Can we know these things or not? Hope that helps,
awesome.
Richard.
Yeah, no, well said. Matter of fact, he followed up and he said, in my defense, random neurological activity forced me to ask that question.
and so then in his defense, he's not responsible for that
exactly.
that response because it was random. Exactly. And so in my paper with JP, we towards the end, we concluded that, like, look, since we all have false metaphysical and theological beliefs, either the entirety of your mental activity is determined by mindless and untrustworthy stuff that knows nothing about metaphysics and theology, and therefore that would be untrustworthy, or it's determined by a deity of deception who determines everybody to get these things wrong, so therefore your beliefs are untrustworthy, or they're completely random and therefore untrustworthy. You don't have reason to think they're any good, or they're determined by an intelligently designed agent created in the image and likeness of a maximally great being, the God of truth, who also wants you to know the truth and has given you the powers to gain metaphysical truth if you handle those powers carefully. But that requires libertarian freedom. So you'll see some of this come out in my debate with Alex Malpass too, which I thought was just a great and fun conversation.
Well said. Last super chat that came in for Tim. Does Molinism hold God thought out all possible worlds before actualizing current? All as in cow flatulence? As in 10:41 a.m. Okay. Cow farts, I guess is what he's talking about, right?
Saying cow A as opposed to cow B. So he's saying
cow A, flatulence. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then another cow A flatulent at 9:40 a.m. Seems like a foolish thing to do.
No, this is a great
I guess what he's trying to get to the point of, for the audience that doesn't follow all these philosophical debates, I'm just trying to help you understand what he's asking is, does God think through all these possible worlds, including every fart of a cow?
I got to put this cow here and have him fart right now.
It has to fart right here and not here, and all this kind of these kinds of things. This is the kind of things philosophers oftentimes discuss over coffee at Starbucks. Just so you're aware. Go ahead, Tim.
This is a great question, Larry. I'm glad you asked it because, I mean, first of all, it depends on the Molinist on who you're gonna. The different Molinists are going to answer this differently. As I've made clear, especially on my website right now, but I plan on unpacking this more in my second edition of the Mere Molinism book. I think that's a really bad view of Molinism, to think that God is thinking all the different possibilities and every different, to put cow A in such a position and then give him a digestive or system where he, it's just, and even especially when we're not talking about cows, but talking about the free choices of each human, I don't think it works like that, and it gets really odd, as he's pointing out here, and kind of absurd. And again, I just want to point people to make sense of this. Go watch Avengers and Infinity War and Endgame, and Doctor Strange was given the power of Molinism and middle knowledge to save the Marvel Comics universe. So did Doctor Strange determine, say, Gamora to knee Star-Lord below the belt twice? And it seems to be a gratuitous suffering. It didn't have to happen. Well, did God say, well, I'm going to put Gamora here in this situation and Peter Quill here in this situation, and then Gamora will then freely choose to knee him below the belt twice, causing significant pain to Star-Lord? No, I don't think it works that way. What did Doctor Strange do? We have no reason to think that Doctor Strange was orchestrating every little step of the way. What did he do? Well, what's the movie called? Endgame. He looked at the end game. God looks at eternity, the eternal end game, right? But Dr. Strange did not orchestrate every little action along the way. Was he surprised by any of it? Absolutely not. He knew everything that would happen in that world if he created it and didn't determine it, including all their free choices. But he wasn't concerned about that stuff. He was looking at the end game. What's the one world in which the evil of Thanos is defeated and all the saints are raised, or all the Avengers are raised from the dead and conquer Thanos under their feet? Does that sound familiar? Right? Look, they ripped the story of Scripture, the eschatology of Scripture, out of the Bible, and that's what you see in Endgame. I think I think God is not concerned about making a cow fart at 1041, or the little free actions along the way. I don't think he orchestrates things like that. He knows the end game. He doesn't look and see or think things through. An omniscient God doesn't do that, but he knows the end game of all the different, or the endings of all and the eternities of all these different worlds. I wrote an academic journal article on this with Jacobus Erasmus, looks like Jacobus Erasmus, and it's called A Molinist Response to John Schellenberg's Hiddenness Argument. It should be free online. But in there, I think we destroyed just about all the problems of evil you can think of, including the problem of divine hiddenness, which is supposed to be the big bad argument right now. And really, I kind of fleshed this out. And this Molinist response is that God created a world, the one world, perhaps, in which he knew that we have free will and that the evil of Satan would eventually be defeated and all the saints would be raised from the dead and the evil would be crushed under our feet. And therefore, everything leading up to that, he's not surprised by any of it, and he knew it would all happen. But he allows it all to happen, including holocausts, including any evil thing you can think of, anything you don't like, degrees of divine hiddenness, animal suffering. If this is the one world where all of that happens, and it's the one world, I don't think universalism is true, but let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just suppose universalism is true. That would be if there's one world in which universalism is true, God would create it, all right? In which universalism and salvation then means you have free will, because salvation, the essence of salvation is love, and you can't have love if it's determined. So it's a freedom permitting scenario, a freedom permitting possible world. So it's feasible, and evil is ultimately defeated. The gates of hell are destroyed, and everybody, I don't think this is true, so don't put words in my mouth, but let's just say everybody comes to Christ. Well, therefore, if that's the one world in which holocausts happen and animal suffering occurs and there's too much divine hiddenness, well, a perfectly intelligent and loving God would create this world if this is the one world in which that occurs. I talk about this a lot more in that article. I want to point people to it, but no, to answer his question, God's not concerned about the cow's fart.
Well, then what about what the Calvinist says, something like Brenton's saying, well, what about dice rolling, birds, hair falling from the head, which he knows all of your hair. It's easy to count Tim's hair on his head, because obviously those are scripture passages which talk about the roll of the dice, the sparrow that falls, the number of hairs on your head. It seems like that's a difference between knowledge and determinism. I mean, God knowing something versus determining it.
And I never say that God doesn't ever determine anything. I think most things are determined. Right? What I argue for is sometimes we've got to have some libertarian free thinking. And if we don't, then God becomes a deity of deception, or in our whole, we experience epistemic meltdown. So I am not saying that God never determines anything. He can determine a roll of a dice if he sees fit. It doesn't mean that he can't interact in the world. Dr. Strange interacted in the same world of free creatures that he actualized. So God can still interact. The problem is when you say that all of your thoughts and beliefs are determined by him, and then you say, and I have false theological beliefs, and that means that same God is making you think incorrectly about theological matters. And then how do you know it's not this one? Careful not to beg the question.
Yeah. And Brenton earlier, I'd started this earlier. He had listened to you talking about, he's, oh man, now we're Gnostics, Muslims, and now we're Mormons. And let me just say in response to that, nobody is calling you a Mormon. Nobody's saying you're a Muslim, and nobody's saying you're a Gnostic. We're saying there's something consistent between Gnostic, Muslims, and Mormons. Well, Gnostics and Muslims, at least we know they both hold to deterministic philosophy. There's a common denominator between Gnostics, Muslims, and Calvinists, the deterministic philosophy. Now, Mormons have something in common in that they use some of the same language, is what Tim was saying, that Christians do, but they mean something different. And that's what he was referring to Mormons. He wasn't saying you're exactly like Mormons. So I just want to clarify that.
And what's really frustrating when I see things like this is, please interact with my exact words. One thing I'm careful to do online when I'm having, and a lot of people don't like this and they take it personally, but I do it as an act of respect. I'll say, okay, well, look, you've written the following, and then I'll quote them. And then I interact with their exact words, because what drives me crazy is when people say, oh, well, what you're actually saying is this. And then they give a straw man and they don't deal with exactly what I've said. And I want to encourage this guy to deal with my exact words.
And it's not just a layman on a side chat. I mean, even Dr. White will do this kind of response, unfortunately. And this is one of the most frustrating things I have with Dr. White is his entire rebuttal to Ken Wilson's book and his Oxford dissertation was basically to lay out all of the weird theological views that the Manichaeans had in order to discredit what the one link that Ken Wilson was drawing from Augustine's former Manichaean Gnosticism was his deterministic philosophy. That one piece was carried into Christianity was the argument. And White's whole debate is, look how different Manichaeanism is from Calvinism. And therefore, Ken's argument's ridiculous. And I'm just like, Ken's not trying to say you're exactly like Manichaeans, guys. He never has. He's not saying you're exactly like the Gnostics were. He never has. He's saying there's a common denominator between the two. It's your determinism. That's the common denominator. And I don't know why someone as bright as I know White is, and even Brenton. I know Brenton's a pretty, and Brenton even says, I was just jesting. You know what I meant? So he was having some fun. Okay, so Brenton,
I'll give him a pass
good. But White's not just jesting. That's the whole thing, is White is a scholar, and he's not just jesting. He spends hour after hour mocking an Oxford scholar with this what Brenton's calling a jest. And it's just that's just crazy to me. Anyway.
Yeah, sorry if I overreacted. Is it Brenton? Is that his name?
Yeah.
No, I'm a little,
I can't tell. He did put a laughy emoji there. True. And so we can't sometimes know.
I'm a little sensitive recently because there's been an onslaught of attack of Tim Stratton, and even the different scholars that I'm working with, some of these folks, they have this little clique, and it's toxic, it's venomous, and they contact people who are working. They're probably going to get a hold of you now, but they probably already written you off. But yeah, I mean, they've contacted JP Moreland and compared me to Ravi Zacharias. So you don't want to work with this guy. I've seen another guy who says, he got on YouTube recently and said, I have never talked bad or attacked Tim Stratton's character. And then somebody sends me a screenshot of him attacking my character. And I'm like, come on, guys, come on, stop it.
And I try, and I usually don't talk about, I don't talk about a lot of the stuff that happens off screen with some of that. But y'all, if you guys saw some of the emails that I've gotten, or the emails that my supervisors at Texas Baptist have gotten, I usually don't talk about it because I don't really want to encourage that kind of behavior. And sometimes by even bringing it up, it gives somebody, oh, that's an idea. I'll contact Leighton's boss at Texas Baptist. You wouldn't believe some of the emails, and some of them have been good, by the way. I appreciate those of you who've written really nice notes to my supervisors to say how much I've helped you. So, hey, there's a hint. You want to help me out. My supervisors can hear how my ministry has helped you. But because they get the negative stuff. And I've gotten stuff, from other YouTubers, Warren, the Idol Killer, and some of the things with Trinity, Trinity guys. And that I've gotten emails. Oh, but I want to warn you about this guy, and tells me all their bad things that they think about him. And man, that's just not the way I like to deal with brothers in the Lord, with his backbiting and condescension and libel kind of accusations about people. And I'm so sorry that even has to come into these things, or, people tattling on you. I mean, I've told a little bit about the story about me leaving. Well, I don't want to get into it. I don't want to go down that road again. But the people write to supervisors, and one of the reasons I'm not teaching at a place that I was teaching at was because a trustee, a giver, financial backer, didn't like me being associated with a particular school. And so one of the reasons I'm teaching at Trinity now is because of that letter or that complaint.
Well, God
which
used
I'm
that
thankful
evil
for
for
now.
good.
Yeah, I think that's an evil for good, because I love Trinity. But it's just crazy to me that kind of thing happens behind the scenes because we disagree with each other. But unfortunately, it does all too often.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to give you one more opportunity as we close to let people know where to find you, to recommend your site. I've already said the links are in the show notes for the debate that you had, for your resources, for your page, for your article that you wrote with JP Moreland is also in the show notes. I want to recommend people to continue to subscribe to your broadcast. But tell anybody listening still that what they need to know about Tim Stratton and about your work coming up, and things that they need to be aware of.
Like you said, my website is freethinkingministries.com or freethinkinc.org. That's freethinkinc.org. YouTube channel, the YouTube channel is called Free Thinking Ministries. So please, it'd be just honored if you would subscribe and interact with me there. I'm on Twitter at TSX Press. So it's supposed to say TS Express. It's really stupid. If I have any regrets in life, it's choosing that.
You could
Twitter
rename
handle.
it. Apparently,
I know,
you could rename it because James White changed his a couple of different times over the years. Yeah.
So I'm gonna have to look into how to do that. But as of right now, it's at TSX PRESS. I got the book Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism, and its study guide. You can find those on Amazon. Currently working on a second edition of that book, but that's going to be a couple years from now. So I do encourage people to get that. I think it's a great intro to the topic. I've had people say they tried to start with Thomas Flint and other guys and couldn't understand it. They read my book and then they went to Thomas Flint and they got it. Encourage people to look at that. And then, just pay attention, for this book that I'm currently working on with these 15 other philosophers. If you're not convinced by anything I'm arguing here, these guys will, men and women actively involved in this, they will probably be able to persuade you. But just want to, just encourage people to keep an open mind. Don't be emotionally attached to a certain view, and be careful. Be willing to rethink some of these things. And as you and I both were, Leighton, we were both Calvinists at one point, and we finally got to a position where like, maybe I should rethink this. And when we do that, I argue that you're exercising libertarian freedom. But anyway, thanks for having me on the show, Leighton. You're a great brother and a great colleague, and really appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate you too, Tim, and thank you for coming on and giving us if you're a theology geek and you haven't had enough, even after almost 3.5 hours, which is almost twice as long as I told Tim that we would probably go, because that's just the way theology geeks work, especially when we come into philosophy and Molinism and all that it entails. It just takes a lot more time to unpack and have fun with. But if you want more, there's a link in the show notes to his debate with Alex over these exact same concepts and issues and his defense of free will. And so go and watch that if you're looking for some more theology geek material. And I'm sure that's where Tim's going to be going right now too.
That's right.
Because he hasn't got to watch it yet. So you can watch it with him as he watches it at home. And so as you leave this place, go now, share Christ and show love. God bless.